Fires all bars qualified.
Message is being broadcast by the Department of Defense of the Republic. At 2 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, multiple unidentified objects were confirmed to have entered Earth's atmosphere.
Discovery Houston, 20 seconds to LOST rescue.
The first message that comes to you is you are a divine being. You matter. You count. You come from realms of unimaginable power and light, and you will return to those realms.
The vast stretches of the unknown and the unanswered and the unfinished still far outstrip our collective comprehension.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Broadcasting from Forest Tower Studios, all the way from the Deep South. Now, here is your host, Joe Root.
Happy New Year, everybody. It is almost 2019. It is December the 27th, which we consider is the last show of Lighting the Void. I'm Joe Root. This is Lighting the Void. Our website is lightingthevoid.com. We are live on thefringe.fm, and you guys are in for a treat. Here's what I wanted to do tonight is all of the interviews and all of the stuff that we've done, everything we've talked about. I have to get somewhere with this show. I mean, yes, it's entertainment, but I feel like I really have to get somewhere, and I feel like we did. 2018 was such a big year. Now, I put out a flyer that said this is the last show of 2018, but I'm not quite sure that's true, because I've been thinking. It may not be. But anyway, so what we're going to do is, based on your feedback and based on our mission here from Lighting the Void, I'm going to play some clips of some of the best of 2018, and we're all going to hang out together and talk about it. So if you want to come hang out with us, we are in the Spreaker chat over here at Lighting the Void on Spreaker. You can also use the Fringe FM chat if you like to drop links and pictures, but we're going to hang out tonight. December the 27th on into the 28th, we are in the hour of Venus. Good. So we're going to spread a little love. And so I want you guys to, for those of you that are into big name people, this is going to be a really awesome show for you. It's going to be a smorgasbord of some of the best clips that we've ever had, okay? Some of the best guests we've ever had. And it was so hard trying to figure out, what was the lesson of 2018? What did we learn? And what were the clips? What are the clips I could pull to figure that out? And there are so many cool shows that it was hard. So, saying that, we may have another hangout session tomorrow night. That just depends on how things go tonight. And then next year, I would like to do something on Friday nights as well, because you've asked for it. Another thing I want to say, too, is if you want to support the show, you can donate via PayPal at lightingthevoid.com. There's the donate button there. There's the Amazon portal. You can grab a t-shirt as well if you'd like. And the newsletter should be out tomorrow. So I don't want to mention this because it's the end of the new year and I want to have fun, right? But look, if you got a complaint about anything, please do not send me a message in Facebook via my personal Facebook Messenger if you got a complaint. I only have a few friends on there that I really talk to begin with. It's not a good place to send, especially station complaints. There's an email for that. It's talkback@thefringe.fm, and that's where we check. So we're not, if we get a complaint anywhere else, it's not valid. And I'm just playing. Also, follow, like, subscribe. Everything is Lighting the Void. Our YouTube archives just broke 3,000. I don't know if it'll stay there, but it did, which is really cool. So the first thing we're going to play tonight is a little thing from Dean Radin, which was August 16th of this year in 2018. And I want you guys to pay attention to this stuff because there's a theme here that I think that we learned in 2018. All right, so here we go. Now, if you want to chat with me and hang out, just come over to the Spreaker chat because I don't want to interrupt this. Welcome back to Lighting the Void. I'm your host, Joe Roop. We are here with Dr. Dean Radin. And in the third hour, we're going to bring on the host Michael Deacon from the End of Days program, who also airs on the Fringe FM. But before the break, we were talking about, in his book, there were some subjects about real evidence, like evidence that magic is real. And I kind of wanted to stay with that, Dr. Radin, about evidence, because evidence is important. If we can show everybody that magic is a real thing, not prove it, like Thomas Campbell said, but just show enough evidence, then maybe more people will pay attention to it.
Right. So the longest chapter in Real Magic is about the scientific evidence. And all of that basically is looking at repeated experiments, classes of experiments that have been done over long periods of time in different laboratories that show that various forms of divination are real, various forms of force of will, and theurgy. There's evidence in all cases. So about a month after the book was published in April 2018, so the very next month in May, in a journal called American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. The APA, American Psychological Association, is the primary academic organization for psychologists in the United States. It's a very large organization, tens of thousands of psychologists, and both professors and students and clinicians all belong to this thing. It's also pretty conservative in terms of how they treat psychic phenomena. Because of the various academic disciplines, psychologists tend to be the most skeptical. If you look at almost every discipline outside of psychology, the level of acceptance is pretty similar to the general public. But within psychology, they're much more skeptical because psychologists learn lots of ways that we can fool ourselves. And so they imagine that psychic phenomena, which includes magic, is just people fooling themselves. But the article that was published in American Psychologist, which is the premier journal for the entire academic psychology system, is this lead article called, with the title, The Experimental Evidence for Parapsychological Phenomena, a review. This was written by a guy named Etzel Cardinha, who's a professor at Lund University, which is in Sweden. So what Etzel did was review 10 different classes of experiments in parapsychology, which studied these phenomena, which I've called magic. And he shows that these are repeated experiments over many, many years. And basically, all of the very classic types of psychic phenomena, we're talking about telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, and some forms of survival of consciousness, all of them show highly significant repeatable effects. So this is really remarkable because this is talking to mainstream conservative psychology in a lead article in the main journal, and is coming out with a statement saying that basically this stuff is real. It's as real as anything else that we know in psychological testing.
Oh.
The other thing, which I do talk about in the book, is the opinion of the president of the American Statistical Association. And this is important because statistics is the area of science that evaluates data. These are mathematicians and statisticians who know how to deal with experimental results and how to interpret it and how to do it correctly. And the president of the American Statistical Association is basically the leader of all of the statisticians, tens of thousands of them. So she said in 2016, as part of her presidential address to the other statisticians, that there were about 6,000 at that conference. Among other things, she said that she had worked as a consultant for the U.S. government program on psychic spying, the same program that I was on, and that she evaluated the evidence for remote viewing, for precognition, and a few other phenomena, and they are as real as any other phenomenon that science has studied.
Wow.
So we now have mainstream psychology, mainstream statistics, both agreeing. Now this is mainstream journals and mainstream people agreeing that these phenomena are real. The phenomena I'm talking about are essentially the practice of magic. So,
and yet it's still taboo, though, right?
Well,
like
but the taboo is beginning to show cracks. Because in the old days, this would never rise up to the level of mainstream discourse. You wouldn't see this kind of thing in mainstream journals, at least not repeatedly in big journals. There have been some articles published in Science and Nature, which are the two top scientific journals in the world, but that was in the 1970s. And then it was a long period from the 70s up until recently where you never saw anything about these topics in the big journals. Now it's starting to come back. And so we go through cycles that are roughly 20 to 30 years long, cycles in politics and cycles in what's popular in science. We're on an upward trend now. And the upward trend, we're beginning to see more and more interest among scientists and academics in these kinds of phenomena. And that's one of the reasons why the book Real Magic, I could have gone out to my buddies who teach about personal development and spirituality and that sort of thing. They would have endorsed the book. But I decided to take a chance and see if I could get my scientific colleagues to endorse the book. And so I was very happy that 2 Nobel laureates, one in physics and one in chemistry, they publicly endorsed the book.
That's great.
And professors from many other disciplines, from people from the National Academy of Sciences, the National Science Foundation, and so on. So these are all top-tier people in science and academia who are saying, even for a book that's about magic, that they're willing to endorse it. And it's not so much that the evidence actually is better now than it was in the 1970s. It's a lot better. But it's more that the taboo is beginning to crack, and it's no longer dangerous, it's at least not as dangerous, for mainstream scientists to begin to admit publicly that, yeah, there's something interesting going on.
Right.
And they don't need to say much more than that in order to start breaking that taboo.
I'm so glad to hear that. Hopefully, have they fixed the Wikipedia page? Someone needs to submit that, put that in there, if it's not in there yet.
Well, Wikipedia is a whole other matter.
Right, yeah.
Wikipedia is supposedly the encyclopedia that anyone could edit, which is simply
make it
not
a very good encyclopedia, if you ask me. If anybody can edit it.
You get what you pay for when it's free. But worse than that, it actually cannot be edited by anybody. There are some pages that have lockdowns, and there are editors who are quite skeptical, and they lock down a page, and you try to change it, and they revert it back within minutes. So some pages, the skeptics who think that they know better than anybody else, they're basically writing a kind of imaginary history.
Yeah.
Where they're only writing negative things and they're not writing the whole story about things. That's why I recommend that if people want to know what's really going on with Wikipedia, it has many, many good qualities in Wikipedia. But when it comes to controversial topics, I recommend that people go to a website called Wikipediocracy. Okay. Wikipediocracy.com tells the backstory of what's actually going on with Wikipedia. And it shows again and again that even topics that you wouldn't think are controversial, the pages that are written on Wikipedia are completely distorted to the point where it's like a story. Now, it's not what is actually real. It's like a story encyclopedia rather than an actual one.
Well, I've found it also and this is just my opinion, that skepticism has become its own religion. I've seen them write articles and do things, and despite the facts, just because something was too wild to believe, even though there was evidence to substantiate it, even if circumstantial, whatever kind of evidence you want, it's there, and they still just want to fight it. And to me, when that happens, it becomes a cult-like mentality. And it's not bad to be skeptic. The word skeptic is a good thing, but
right.
It's almost like there's certain, I guess you could say, organizations out there trying to make a religion out of it. And I don't think that's a good thing. I think it's actually going backwards to do that.
I agree. So those skeptics are actually not true skeptics, as you said, because skeptical means being doubtful, but also open. So if you're doubtful without being open, then that's simply intolerant. That's not a proper way of trying to evaluate complex data.
Right.
And unfortunately, you see that on Wikipedia quite a bit.
Now, there is a subject here that I have to ask about because it's popping up in the chat room, and this whole concept of white and black magic. I was actually on another podcast where I talked about this, Nicole Frolick's podcast, that's releasing later this week. Do you believe that there are two sides of magic, that there is black and white magic? Before I ask the next question.
Well, yeah. So the what's white and what's black is, in my view, or at least my understanding of magic, that if you do magic that is intended to override somebody else's free will, that's black magic.
Okay. Easy enough, right?
Yeah, and almost anything else is white magic.
And the case of go ahead, I'm sorry.
So there's a subtlety here. So let's say somebody believes that they can heal somebody with magic. Like prayer is a form of magic. Prayer is an intentional influence. So somebody is ill, and you decide you want to pray for them to be better. If they don't know that you're praying for them, that's black magic.
Really?
Because you're attempting to do something to them, even though it's for beneficial reasons, but they don't give you permission to do it. They don't know that you're doing it. That is overriding their free will, and is black magic.
So if my grandmother is sick with cancer, and she doesn't know I'm praying for her healing, that's black magic?
That's a no-no.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, if you take seriously the idea that the drawing the red line that separates white and black magic is overriding somebody else's free will, that means you can't do anything for them, even for their benefit, unless they know about it. They have to give permission for it.
So it would be more...
This is related, by the way. It's sort of vaguely related to the legend about the vampire. The vampire cannot come into your house unless you give permission. It's like it's the free will element is an extremely important aspect of how these kinds of phenomena seem to work.
This is a highly debatable conversation I've seen on many threads where people talk about this. Like, hey, if there was a cancer, wouldn't you get it out? Even if no one knew that you were doing it, and other people say what you say. Well, it's really not your decision to make, right?
Right. Right.
And I can see that too, because I can tell you, it's a long story, and I won't go into it, but I can tell you of instances when I was a child that my grandmother and grandfather did a certain set of Hebrew prayers over me, just to get me away from all the bad stuff I was around. Yes, it got me away from that stuff, but the stuff that happened to get me away from it, I wouldn't wish on anybody. So yeah. I can see your point, actually.
Yeah. And so there's a gray area. The gray area are things like binding spells. So the binding spell is to prevent harm from coming to somebody else, right? So it's for a benefit of somebody, but in order to prevent someone from being harmed, it is overriding somebody else's, typically, not always, but typically it's preventing somebody else from doing something bad. So this is now a moral quandary, right? You're preventing somebody who's a bad person from doing something in order to save this other person. Well, is that black magic or not? Well, it's neither. It's in the gray zone, and because there is a gray zone, then that's where the debates come from. It's very similar to the idea of somebody has a bad illness and you want to help them, but if you don't have the permission, is that okay? Well, it's kind of a gray zone, and it's either darker gray or lighter gray, depending on how you see it.
Yeah, Will is wanting to know, do you have any recommendations? And here comes the questions we were talking about earlier. How do you recommend this, right? Do you have any recommendations of protection against black magic?
Yeah.
That's a tough one, because I don't, when people ask me that, I'm thinking, what do you normally do, Right.
So the usual response that you would get from a magician is to come up with a ritual that you believe that will protect you from that. Typically, imagine a shield of white light around yourself, or a mirror, or something like that. That's what you find again and again in most of the books about this. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of famous books. One is called Psychic Self-Defense.
Yeah, Dion Fortune. That's a great one.
Dion Fortune. So that was written in the 1920s, I think. What she says in there is pretty much what I just said. You develop a ritual that you imagine that you are protected, and you have to believe that you are protected, and that's sufficient. Otherwise, you find somebody that you trust, who apparently has a handle on knowing what to do, and you ask for their assistance. And of course, that's fraught with all kinds of problems, because a lot of people who represent themselves as being psychics or magicians are frauds.
Yeah,
and so
that's for sure.
You have to rely on word of mouth and good reputations and all the rest in order to decide whether you want to go with that person or not.
Well, I can say one thing that I am glad, another reason I'm glad that this book is out, and, man, I really haven't said this before, but magic is being it's being sold kind of like the alien thing is being sold. You know how movies sell things, and then there's a reality to it, right? So it's being marketed in a certain way right now by certain people, and I don't totally agree with it. When I see your book come out, I look at all your other books, and they're about, you know, the reality of consciousness, entangled minds, the conscious universe. And then you release a book about magic, which is, this is about power. You know, this is kind of about how to manipulate this system. And after reading it, I got to say, man, it is really set apart from everything else that's come out today. You know, it's kind of like Gordon's work. It's the real deal, tells you the real history, tells you the real evidence. And I just, you know, I'm not trying to blow smoke, but I'm very, very happy that this book is out. I'm glad that it's here.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. You'll notice that one of the things I don't spend much time on in this book, which you do find in most books on magic, are things like protection spells and practice of magic. How do you use this stuff? Because I figured that, first of all, I'm writing this for scientists and academics as well as lay people. I figured it's important to provide a baseline, a scholarly baseline, even though it's written in a non-scholarly way, to show that, first of all, we're dealing with something which is real. From a scientific perspective, this is extremely radical. Scientists don't like the idea that magic might be real because it screws up the whole scientific process.
Right.
Nevertheless, it is a real thing. That's already super radical. Once you get past that, then all of these really interesting questions come along, like how do you explain it? How do you use it? What are the dangers? All of those things. Well, that's going to be another book. I just wanted in this book to simply lay out we are dealing with something which is quite real, and this is why. So that's what that book is about.
Yeah, it's perfect for that, too. I mean, that's exactly what it's about. I'm probably going to read it 2 or 3 times. You know, I honestly think that it's going to help me kind of maybe argue with the skeptics a little bit. And I know that's not why you wrote it. I can definitely tell that's not why you wrote it. But I've always struggled with the words to describe the history of it when it comes to the mystery schools, Gnosticism. I've struggled with talking about evidence, and you really just made it clear in this book. And I hope that my audience will take the time out to grab it. You can even get it through Audible. It's a bestseller in its class, not its class, but its genre right now on Amazon, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and the audiobook is doing particularly well.
Yeah, that's the book I got. We just got a couple of minutes here left. Do you have anything coming up that you would like to talk about? Do you have any conferences or speaking events? Or are you working on any other books? Or just anything else you'd like to share with us? By all means, plug away.
Well, I can just mention that last month I was traveling in Germany and Italy at conferences. The one in Germany was particularly interesting because it was sponsored by the pharmaceutical company Merck. So Merck is a really big company. I forget how much the profit is in the tens of billions of euros. So they're a big company. They do pharmaceuticals and materials and some life science products. And they had this big international conference. It had 5 Nobel laureates and 30 other top-tier scientists from around the world talking about innovation in science. And so I was one of the invited speakers. And when they invited me, I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? Because I don't know anything about the pharmaceutical business. And they said, well, we like your book about magic. And I said, really?
Wow.
Yeah. And the reason was that the Merck company, which is not the one in the U.S., there's a company with a similar name, but the German company, Merck, they had this conference to celebrate their 350th anniversary. Very few companies last that long. And the reason they do is because they take innovation very seriously. And in order to continually be innovative in a business, you have to maintain curiosity. Mm-hmm. So they wanted a topic that they knew everybody would find curious, but also had a scientific basis. So I talked about magic, the evidence for magic, which, of course, everybody was fascinated with, because who wouldn't be? And very few people know the actual evidence, the scientific evidence for magic. So I went through that, and they all found it fabulously interesting. So this doesn't happen very often in the United States.
No, I don't think it would. No, that's really cool.
So most of the talks that I've given for large companies, for governments, for business, have been outside the United States. So the taboo is much stronger here than it is almost anywhere else in the world.
That's impressive, though. That lets you know that just everybody's curious about it. I think it's I think it's very cool. I think that's progress, if you ask me, as far as the awareness of it. And I do, like I said, I want to thank you for spending this time with us on Lighting the Void. I can't wait till your next book comes out. You do plan on writing more, right? Because I'm addicted to your writings.
Yeah, I have a couple more in mind, yes.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on this program. Dr. Dean Radin, everybody. And it's deanradin.org, right? That's the new website?
That's right, yep.
All right. You guys, we're going to be right back for hour 3 with Michael Deacon. Again, Dr. Dean Radin, thank you very much for coming on Lighting the Void. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right, so we're going to stay in August, and we're going to take a left turn here, August of 2018. But it's not really a hard left turn. And another thing I think that I'm noticing here is I don't know if it's going to be a progression or a digression of sound quality as we were building the studio through this year, too. But this one is August. It was actually the day before Dean Radin come on. And this is the NASA physicist and also author of My Big Toe, Thomas Campbell.
Inside each and every one of us is one true, authentic swing. Something we was born with. Something that's ours and ours alone. Something can't be taught to you or learned. Something that got to be remembered. Over time, the world can rob us of that swing and get buried inside us under all our wouldas and couldas and shouldas. Some folk even forget what they swing was like. Some folk even forget what they swing was like. Keep swinging.
But I don't have any balls.
And don't worry about hitting the ball the way it's going to go. Just swing the club. Feel the club. Come on, close your eyes.
Close them.
Yeah, you can't make that ball go in that hole. You have to let it. I want you to feel the club rolling off your feel the weight of the club. Sailing on the perfect line, dropping out that high, soft as butter. Listen to the sounds of the night. Just keep swinging that club till you gotta breathe inside each and see every one of us is one true, authentic swing. Just keep swinging that club till authentic swing, part of the whole thing. Something we was born with. Take a deep breath. That's a good thing. Listen to the sounds of the night.
I don't feel a thing.
Just keep swinging that club till you're part of the whole thing. That's a good thing. Can you see it?
We're going to continue this interview, and I wanted to speak about some science exclusively, like quantum entanglement, because we were talking about that the other night. So I did want to ask about quantum mechanics a little bit. I understand some of it, like the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox that demonstrated, I guess, the principle of non-locality, which is kind of what they're doing with, I guess, particles now and stuff. But, the idea that distant objects can have a direct, instantaneous influence on one another, right? Mm-hmm. So...
Entanglement, basically.
And it entangles at non-locality, meaning... What I'm getting at is, how come if I travel to Mars or whatever and it's so real or in my mind, but in seconds, I say less than the speed of light or faster than the speed of light, I can wake up. There's no distance. It's almost like it doesn't exist.
There is no distance outside of this physical. The distance is just part of the physical reality. It's computed. You know how you make space? If you ask a traditional physicist where space comes from, he won't have a clue. You ask him where time comes from, he won't have a clue either. You ask him where mass comes from and charge comes from, and they won't have a clue about any of that. Physicists have no idea where all the basic pieces of their science even come from. They just mysteriously exist because they do. You see? Well, if you look at it from a virtual reality perspective, you can see where all of it comes from. It's all computed. It's part of the rule set. How do you make space? You put a point someplace, pick a point anywhere, and then put 3 unit vectors that are perpendicular to each other, 3 orthogonal unit vectors, starting at that point. That's it. That's a 3-dimensional space. By unit vectors, I'm basically, make this into non-math speak. You take a point and you put an X, Y, and Z axis through that point. And now you have space defined. That's all space is. It's a calculation. It's not a fundamental thing in itself. It's a calculated thing. You see? So that is
I'm trying to understand this microtubule thing. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but I think it's just a theory. I think it's just a theory in quantum mechanics, a theory of consciousness that some people have put out because they're trying to explain how these things, like how can a shaman go on a journey and then instantaneously come back faster than the speed of light? And they're trying to put words to it.
Yeah, well, the thing with the microtubules is trying to make consciousness from a physical source. That's materialists trying to solve the hard problem, which they can't do. Yeah, and they're doing it, and it's not very credible at all. What they have done is they say, within consciousness, you have things that are non-local. Within quantum mechanics, you have things that are non-local. Therefore, consciousness must be an artifact of quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics is the only thing we know that's non-local, and so is consciousness. And because this is a material reality, consciousness has to be created with quantum mechanics. Well, quantum mechanics and microtubules, the fact that they're micro and very small where quantum mechanics plays, that's what they're trying to do. So they come up with this microtubules just to create some kind of quantum system that will then create consciousness. Well, that is very bad logic. Just because they have one thing in common doesn't mean that one causes the other. Rocket ships fly and birds fly. Therefore, birds must be little rocket ships. You see? That's poor logic. They have something in common. They both fly, but it doesn't make one of them the cause of the other. See, that's kind of a bad idea. So the microtubules is a way of creating consciousness, and it doesn't work, and they're not going to get anywhere with it because it doesn't really work that way. All they can do is say quantum mechanics must be at the root, and therefore some quantum system is responsible for consciousness. And that's as far as they'll get, which is basically a statement of where they'd like to go, but there isn't going to be any logic to take them from some place that we know to that place that they want to go. So that's what that's about. As far as entanglement goes, it's a simple thing. Entanglement is an if-then statement. If this, then that. If spin up, then spin down. A spin-up, spin-down pair, an entangled pair, is a single system. It's one thing. And in that single system, there's an if-then statement that says if one of them spin up, the other one spin down, and that's because you need a spin up and spin down for the conservation of angular momentum. And that's why when a particle suddenly, when a bunch of energy creates two entangled particles, that's why it has to have the same amount of angular momentum and linear momentum that you had before in that energy. It has to have the same. You see, there's conservation of energy. Total energy has to be the same as well. So that's a single system based on conservation laws, and it's easy to produce as an if-then statement in a computer code. So that's what's basically going on there. Those are people trying very hard to maintain a materialist view of the world, even when consciousness and quantum mechanics both defy materialism. And just claiming that, well, they both defy it, then one must be the cause of the other is not even logic.
Well, they started talking about the holographic universe, and then it explained it, and I was with them on that one, and then they got into the microtubule thing, which kind of went back to a physical explanation of a holographic universe, which didn't really make sense to me to begin with. So they lost me there.
Right, it doesn't make any sense, and that's because they're just waving their hands. There isn't any logic there. The holographic universe is really not a very good metaphor. Some of the things they say are interesting, but again, they're trying to push physics into spaces. They're trying to push a materialist physics into spaces where it can't play. And the metaphors are unfortunate. It's not a hologram. We know what a hologram is. It's a interference pattern that if you shine light back through the interference pattern, the light will manifest in the source. You'll have a little ball of light that looks like the source. Mm-hmm. So you start with the source and you put laser lights on it from different directions. That the laser light bounces off the source from those different directions, creates an interference pattern on a piece of film. Now, you take that film and shine laser light back through it again, and you'll see the source, whatever it is, a child's ABC block or a picture of, a little statue or whatever you'll see. Now you'll see it as light because the light will goes back, back and forth. Either way, it works. Whether you make the diffraction pattern with the laser light or send the laser light back through the diffraction pattern and make a little ball of light there that's in the pattern of the source. That's what we have, and that is not what's going on in the universe. This is not a holographic universe. But what they meant by that is that the universe seems to have pattern to it, and it seems that the pieces of it contain all the information in the whole. Yeah. And that's the way, because of that idea, that is the way that they've come up with this idea. Well, it must be a hologram then, even though that's nonsense. It's nobody shining a laser light through a diffraction pattern to create this 3D reality. When you make a hologram, that light that makes that image of that chess piece, you can move your finger right through it, right? It's not a solid object. It's just light. It's not a holographic universe. They're using holograph as a metaphor,
gotcha.
not as a fact.
Not as a real hologram, but just as a metaphor.
It's just a metaphor for something we don't understand that's really cool, and it seems like the pieces of it will have all the information of the whole. Well, there's something else that has that same quality, where the pieces contain all the information of the whole, and it is fundamental in our reality, and it's called a fractal.
Gotcha.
Okay. And yes, this is a fractal reality. And yes, there's a thing I created, a concept that I created is called a process fractal rather than a geometric fractal. And a process fractal is a process that the output then gets turned around and feeds back into the input. And when you take an output and feed it into the input like that, you create a process fractal. And that's what evolution is. Evolution is a process fractal. That's how you can start with something simple like a cell or a couple of cells, and 200 million years later, you've got the planet Earth with all the bushes and plants and snails and humans and antelope and monkeys and everything else on it, just from that cell evolving. You see? That's what fractals do. They start with simple things, they keep iterating, and they build up these huge, detailed things. It's a fractal process. So that's why they call it, this idea that it's laser light shining through a diffraction pattern is silly. That makes no sense whatsoever. Well, It's a metaphor. What's it a metaphor for? Well, if they really knew, they wouldn't have had to use a metaphor like that.
Right. I get what you're saying.
They wouldn't have to use a very general, non-specific, doesn't make any sense metaphor.
Uh-huh.
Okay? They could use something that was a little better. Well, because they use a very generic kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense metaphor, tells you that they don't really have a clue. It just sounds good because they know that just the physical reality by itself doesn't play. Everybody in physics knows that, even though a lot of them don't admit it. So they're coming up with these bizarre ideas to try to make it play. Well, yes, if you talk about distance, there is no distance outside of this virtual reality. Distance is created. Once you get into the consciousness space, there is no distance. There is no place. That's a 3D. That's a geometric construction. You see, and now you say, well, then I can't visualize it. Well, no, you can't. You're a 3D person and you have all your experiences 3D, and you can't visualize or think about anything that isn't 3D because that's your whole experience base. But you can deal with abstract thoughts and abstract relationships. So you can actually work out the answers even though you're stuck in the 3D world. It's just they're abstract. You end up with a metaphor. It's another metaphor that I call the larger consciousness system.
Gotcha. Now, all of this stuff you talk about, because I've got all three of your books. I'm taking it in as slow as possible, to be honest with you. But I have them for life now, all three of them. Mm-hmm. Does your books, the My Big Toe series, do they encapsulate pretty much everything that you're trying to teach us, or is there more outside of that?
Well, the books themselves give a really good overview of the basic theory. Yes, they do that. And the thing that you'll find elsewhere, mainly on YouTube, is the more science aspects of it, the applications. Okay, you have theory, and from that theory, you have, millions of logical consequences. So that's like you take Newton's laws, right? That aren't laws. Take those equations, and you got like 4 or 5 equations, and they're not even real big equations. And the logical consequences of those equations are almost every physical thing that happens in the macro world. Okay?
Gotcha.
Things that you wouldn't necessarily say, well, okay, no two things are in the same place. Well, yeah, okay, any idiot could figure that out. He wasn't that smart. Even I could have figured that out. Well, there are logical consequences to that. And it's not just a simple statement, but there's logical consequences. So the books, the 3 books, will give you the basic theory. Now, a lot of the logical consequences of that theory have been talked about in the videos. And science, physics, is one of the logical consequences of that theory. That you can end up saying why C is a constant and why quantum mechanics have to be, in terms of probability distributions. It's not that that there's no other logical choice. That's what they have to be. Okay. And these are just logical things that fall out of the bigger theory. So the bigger theory is there in the books. YouTube will give you a lot more of the logical consequences and develop more of the science, more of the application. People say, well, how do I apply this to my life? All right, here I am, I'm this and that. I'm stuck in a job I don't like. My life isn't very happy. I have a terrible relationship. What's wrong? What do I need to fix? Well, then you can tell them. According to MBT theory, you can just write a very short list of here's what you have to fix. Here's what's wrong. So it affects people's lives. And that discussion, obviously, if you just say, well, here's a list, that's done, next, it's not going to help that person very much. They walk off with a list. You have to discuss it. You have to explain. You have to get them to the point where they can actually see what it is you're talking about. Paradigm shifts are never easy. So a lot of the YouTube is in this explanation, deriving logical consequences and explaining to people in ways that they can understand what these principles mean to their everyday life. So that's what else is out there. So for most people, the books are good, and it gives them a good foundation. And after that, the YouTube videos kind of fill in the details for them.
But you've got a mass amount of information on those YouTube channels. I really recommend anybody that's listening to go there. You make so much sense with all this stuff. It's just, I wonder sometimes why somebody like you or maybe Robert Monroe could easily do it. It just happened to him. Like, they didn't even know what was happening. Robert didn't know what was happening to him.
No, he did not, and he had no idea about what it all meant. He thought, when he went out of body, he thought he was going to a place that existed there, independent of him, his mind, his intent, and his interpretation. He thought that it was like that. So he goes out to his park, or he goes meets somebody and does something, and for him, all of that was like another physical reality that just isn't physical. And it's not like that. But he didn't know that. He knew as much as he could know. And he was a good reporter. He didn't embellish. Mm-hmm. He tended to say just what it was he got. But he was forced to interpret, because everybody has to interpret the data. If they're going to tell it to somebody else, you have to interpret. Even if they're going to think about it themselves, you interpret it. Your interpretation sticks you with your own knowledge base, your own experience base. So he'd interpret in terms of the things he knew,
right?
The things he believed. So but he did a good job. So yeah, it just happened to him. Why did it happen to him? Because the world was ready for a set of 3 books that would introduce them to a larger reality.
I was always wondering that, like, why did it just happen to him, and I have to really try or do some methods that you taught me or someone else taught me to try to do these things, and he would just lay down and bam, he's out doing all these things, and I'm extremely jealous, to be honest with you. This just happens to some people, not just Robert Monroe, but well, I never asked, did I ask you this? Did this just happen to you, or did he teach you how to do these things? I don't know if I ever asked you that.
Yeah, well, if you have you read book 1 yet?
Yeah, I read book 1, but it's been a while. So that question I can figure out on my own, pretty much.
Well, book 1 will tell you that, and I can tell you even more than that, that I had experiences of, I had entities come teach me how to get out of body when I was like 5, 6, 7 years old. And so it happened to me like that too. I didn't ask for it. It just happened. But then that got turned off. And it wasn't until I'm now in my, middle to late 20s that I run into Bob Monroe and I start doing it from that viewpoint. So yes, I had it. It did just happen to me naturally, but not in a continuous way the way it did with Bob. Although some of the very same things that I did when I was, let's say, 7 years old were experiences that Bob had as well as an adult. Because when I was out of body then, I was an adult. I wasn't a child anymore.
Right.
So that's kind of strange. But then when I was with Bob, everything came back pretty quickly, and I was a very fast study. First time I tried to meditate, I was immensely successful with it. So I've been probably working on getting ready and whatever for this sort of thing for multiple lifetimes, not just this one. So yes, I've always been a very fast study in these sorts of things. Things come natural to me.
That's for sure. Because the last time I interviewed you, we were on video, and you, during the break, I came back, I got a drink, I came back, and you were just leaned back with your eyes shut. And I thought, well, maybe he's tired. Maybe he's taking a nap. And you kind of heard me, and you was like, no, I'm here. I just choose to go other places when I want to. Something of that nature is what you said. Like you could just travel. And yes. I've always been extremely jealous of that. And I would love to go on one of these immersions. I've actually been invited to one, and I hope I can go. Do you try to help people learn how to do that on these immersions that you do?
Yes, that's the point. Helping them get personal access to the larger consciousness system.
That's amazing stuff. And I just, what I was saying when it got disconnected is I think last time you told me the reason why I couldn't do these things and other things happened. It just happened naturally to, I guess, certain people, and people like me couldn't really do them the way you guys could is because of our paradigm, our fears and our expectations. And we had to let go of all that. Is that right?
Pretty much. That's right. And it takes a long time to let go of all that. Yes. That's pretty much it.
It seems to me, though, that the experience I had when I did go out of body, that I could see what was really happening. And then I've had other experiences where it was in a dream. It's like a dreamlike state. Mm-hmm. One is way more vivid. The colors were brighter, the edges were sharper. There was almost some kind of hum. And in that state I was in the physical, like I saw things that were happening. I verified it through my notebooks. Mm-hmm. And then other things that I've done were just wacky dreams. And everyone keeps telling me, well, you're in the same place, really. You just don't know it. But it feels like layers to me. Is that my mind, or is that an actual structure?
Yeah, no, there are layers, but it's not structure like you think. Your reality is your interpretation of a data stream that you're receiving from the virtual reality server. Okay, so you're a player. You get a data stream from the server, the rendering engine, if you like, for the virtual reality, and you interpret that data as this reality. All right. If you let go of this reality, you let go of all your sense data to where you're no longer processing sense data. You can get hold of or be given another data stream, and that other data stream then becomes a different reality for you.
Gotcha.
Okay? So there are multiple realities. These are really multiple data streams. Now, why do you get one kind one time and a different time the next? It depends on you, pretty much. It depends on what you bring to the table. It depends how quiet your mind is. It depends how settled you are emotionally, what level of fear that you have. It also depends on what the system would like to teach you or what it thinks you can learn. So the very first one, or some of the initial ones, often tend to be really the best ones because they're perfectly clear. The system is just letting you see what it's like to be aware of this physical reality from a viewpoint of consciousness. And then that's that perfectly clear, amazing place. Then you looked around and you saw things that you could check out later. And that was meant, the reason you saw those things, or those things came to your attention, you could check them out later. The system wanted to give you an experience where you could verify it for yourself that it was real and not just in your imagination. Therefore, they give you something that you will see, that you can check out, that otherwise you couldn't have known. So that's what happens. Now, next time, you could maybe repeat that process 2 or 3 times till you got good at it. Or you may not need to repeat that process. Or you may just have taken that information and got real enthusiastic about seeing stuff and be able to look here and there and remote viewing or whatever, but missed the bigger point about growing up and bigger reality and that sort of thing. Who knows? But the next time you go up, and maybe it's just the point that your mind's in, the attitude that you have then. You have expectations. The expectations get in the way. Expectations are beliefs. So they get in the way. So now you have a hard time having it again because the first one you have is getting in the way. You can't just relax and let it happen anymore. You want it to happen the way it was that time. And that could be the problem why you're not so successful this time. So that happens a lot. It's, again, if you get clear of all the fear and the beliefs and the ego, then things get a lot easier. Trying to push through it with those things intact, you can do with enough practice, but it's just a lot harder way to go.
I wonder if that's why I got shoved back in my body. That one time I was doing a method that I'd learned and I from somebody else, and I felt the vibration. So I was doing the whole roll out of your body type thing, right? Right. And I knew when the vibrations hit that I just needed to relax for a little bit and then move. Well, I couldn't move. It felt like I was stuck in a shell. And I'd said some type of command like, I command you to release me by life and light. But my voice sounded like James Earl Jones when I said it. It was really weird. And these they look like Rorschach things, little blobs, immediately just came down and just kind of shoved me back in, like held me from getting out. And I woke up and I was like, what is that? And for every time I tell that story, psychics or mystics, they'll tell me that these are my guides that are saying I'm not ready and this and that. And I find that so hard to believe because I feel like I'm ready. I want to do this,
Yeah. Well, what they're trying to do is come up with plausible reasons. And there could be a lot of different reasons besides that your guides trying to push you back in. And then why did your guides turn into Rorschach test blobs and that sort of thing? That doesn't really make any sense either. I would agree with that. That's probably not really what was going on, but it's probably true. Their interpretation's wrong, but the fundamental reason is probably still right. And that's that you weren't ready. You weren't ready in a sense that, not that you didn't want the experience and that you weren't ready to have it, but you weren't ready in the sense that your mind was quiet enough, that your ego was still and absent enough, and that you didn't have expectations or other things going on. What happened is you probably got too excited. Mm-hmm. You got those pulsations, and it's like, oh boy, okay, I got it now, and your expectation level and your excitement goes up. Well, all that expectation, excitement's all in the intellect. So what that does is just brings you right out of the being level into the intellectual level, and then nothing happens. It just kind of fizzles. Well, when it fizzles, you have to do some kind of you get some sort of data, and the information you got, it isn't working. And it's true that you weren't ready, but not that you weren't ready by desire. You weren't ready by then because you were in the intellectual part of yourself, not in the being level part. At least this would be my first guess at it.
Yeah, I wanted out so bad I was trying to force it,
Right, exactly. That's the thing. And when you do that, then you break it. And as you break it, you had the sense of falling back away from it. Like you weren't on the edge anymore. You were getting farther and farther away from the edge. And you interpret that as, being, because you really want to do it, but you're getting further away from the edge. That means something must be prohibiting you or pushing you away. So then you manifest something that's pushing you back. And why little ink blots? Well, that's
who knows, right?
Who knows? Yeah. You just needed something that was pushing you back, and that was nondescript. Anything else would have taken more, visual acuity to make up something. If his little green men with pointy ears were pushing you back, then you would have had to manifest all of that imagery. It's easier to just have a blob or a dark light or a feeling or a hand pushes you, in the chest and pushes you back. That kind of stuff is common, and people are just making up something, whatever it is that's keeping them from getting in and pushing them back. That's what it is they're interpreting that, and there's really nothing doing that. They just feel that there must be because they feel they're getting further and further away from it because they're getting more and more in their intellect. Therefore, something must be keeping them out. Therefore, they manifest something that is keeping them out. when you get into these states, what you think manifests very, very easily.
When you get into these states, what you think manifests very easily and very quickly. So we're here back again. If you want to join us in the Spreaker chat, you can right now. We're live playing the best of 2018. So we're going to leave August and two of the best men in their field of study talking about consciousness and magic and astral travel. And so we're going to double back here and take a right turn, and we're going to go to March of 2018. And this one was one of my favorites, and I'm sure it will be yours too as well, when we interviewed Dr. Robert Schoch. Dr. Robert Schoch, thank you for coming on Lighting the Void the first time. This is really awesome.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure.
So your research, everybody likes to talk about, the water erosion of the Sphinx, your work with John Anthony West. It's been a topic of major discussion for years and years. But, when I went to your website, and I'm going to admit, and I don't want you to get upset with me, but when I looked at all of the research that you've actually done, I don't know why we're not talking more about this. There's especially this solar outburst deal. I mean, this is a reality that we need to be paying attention to, right?
Oh, I agree. I absolutely agree. Something that I think we need to take into account. And I say this, how do I want to say this? I love the ancient civilizations, and I started in Egypt working with John Anthony West, who I think people probably know, but I'll say he was my dear colleague and my dear friend, and he died of cancer ultimately February 6th, just a month, not even 2 months ago. And so many people know of me or know of him, John Anthony West, and myself for our work in Egypt and redating the Sphinx and pushing civilization back thousands of years earlier. And that's all wonderful and fine and interesting, but I've had many people say to me over the years, well, what does it really matter? It's sort of interesting, yeah, and it revolutionizes history and rewrites what we know about the origins of civilization. But what matters to my mind is not just that we're pushing back, or I've pushed back the origins of civilization, but it is what caused that, I call it the earlier cycle of civilization, to collapse, to have been destroyed, to have disappeared. And that was the natural catastrophe that ended the last ice age, major solar outburst that you were just referencing. And this is important because our sun is a star. Just like other stars, it's not always stable. It goes through periods of instability. It destroyed civilizations 12,000 years ago. It brought about major Earth changes. And this is well known in the geological record. This isn't something that, is channeled or whatnot. I'm not making fun of channelers.
Sure.
But, this is straightforward science, that there were major changes 12,000 years ago, to be precise, 9,700 BC. Major climatic changes, major changes when it came to things like our records of earthquake activity, volcanic activity, changes in the atmosphere, changes in the magnetosphere, allowing more radiation to come down to the surface of the Earth. This is reflected in major extinctions of mammals on Earth, large mammals. It's reflected, frankly, in a major catastrophe for humans, not just the civilizations of the time, but, to be crude, a lot of people were killed because of the major changes, and the rest that survived really survived by going into hiding, primarily underground into caves, etc., before they reemerged. But the bottom line is, this is not just super interesting, but it could happen again. And all the indications are, and I'm not someone who likes to, I'm not a prepper, as some people call them, who,
right.
Claiming doomsday is coming around the corner and we better, get ready for it. Oh, and by the way, I can sell you a survival kit. I don't have anything to sell like that. I mean, I hope people will buy my book, but that's just for the information.
Right.
And so I'm not like that. In fact, I don't even like talking about this, but I think we have to face reality. We have to face the real scientific evidence, and that is that this happened again, and it happened before, and it will happen again. This is the way geology works. This is the way the cycles of the Earth, the cycles of the sun work.
Right.
So it's much more, to me, than just, looking at ancient civilizations, and isn't that fascinating? That's how it started for me. But there are real lessons to be learned.
So is this something that you discovered further down the road in your research, as in your studies? That's something that you came to understand as you looked at these geographical sites and history? It was something that it something that you've always studied?
No, that's absolutely correct. What you just said is basically correct. Let me put it into a bigger context. As you mentioned in the intro, my degree, my PhD, is geology and geophysics from Yale. I graduated from Yale back in 1983, which seems like a very long time ago now. To some people, it's still fresh in my mind. And at that time, I was not working on the Sphinx. I was interested in ancient civilizations, but I was really trained as a geologist, as a very much a field geologist and geophysicist, something at that time that was a fascinating topic for me and for many of my colleagues, and still is, was what was happening at the end of the last ice age, what was occurring. And I'm now speaking geologically and climatologically, what was occurring. We were, even back then, reconstructing what was occurring, but we didn't realize how intense it was, how fast it occurred, and there was no good explanation as to why it occurred. Now, the explanation that I just proposed was solar outburst. So it was a topic that was of interest to me, what was happening at the end of the last ice age, that then combined with my work on ancient civilizations, because back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, I wasn't studying ancient civilizations intensely. Certainly at that time, I simply accepted the dogma of the day, which is still the conventional wisdom for many people in and out of academia, that civilization originated a mere 5,000-6,000 years ago, 3,000, 4,000 BC. In the late 1980s, I first met John Anthony West. He was the one who really introduced me to the concept that, maybe civilization goes back further, and he was basing this on the Sphinx and on a fellow named Schwaller de Lubitsch. I hate to throw around so many names, but the late Schwaller de Lubitsch and John Anthony West was a expert on Schwaller's work, Symbolist Egypt, as it's sometimes called, a different interpretation of Egypt. Schwaller had noticed that the Sphinx seemed to be weathered by water, not by wind and sand. This was incompatible with the Sahara conditions that the Sphinx now occupies. It's on the edge of the Sahara. So Schwaller had suggested that maybe the Sphinx goes back to a much earlier period, but this would make no sense if civilization simply began around 3000 BC. So my introduction to Egypt was really through the invitation of John Anthony West to travel to Egypt with him as a geologist, explicitly as a geologist, to analyze the geological features of the Great Sphinx. Lo and behold, to make a very long story very short, it turns out that the evidence stands up. The Sphinx was weathered by water, not by wind and sand, at least the primary weathering on it. This has to go back to a much earlier climatic period, pushes the date of the Sphinx back to an earlier period, ends up pushing the age of civilization back to a much earlier period, back to the end of the last ice age. Civilization collapsed, was devastated about 12,000 years ago. Why? This ties in now with the geological evidence for the end of the last ice age, and it sort of came full circle for me in my career, putting all these things together.
Wow. I've always wondered when I was discovering this about you and your friendship with John Anthony West, and, being in this scholarly section of work that you are, when you saw that for the first time, I always wondered what your thoughts were. Was it a thought of, I must talk about this, but I'm afraid, or did you fight it a little bit? I mean, because you'd have to think if I'm going to present this to anyone, to any community, to any scholarly community about this, that it goes against everything that we've ever been taught. There's going to be a little bit of backlash, but I'm just curious about what your thoughts on that. Were you afraid at the time?
I can tell you, John Anthony West was very, very frustrated with me because immediately, when I first saw the Sphinx, there were two things that immediately went through my mind. Okay, so this is in my mind, and this is within minutes. Actually, I sometimes say within 30 seconds, and it probably was within 30 seconds. One is that I saw geologically there was something amiss. There was something wrong. The type, the nature of the weathering and erosion on the Sphinx and the walls of the Sphinx enclosure did not fit the time frame that Egyptologists were saying, that they were giving. They were saying that the Sphinx was carved from scratch from the bedrock in 2500 BC, and what I was seeing geologically, that did not make sense. It had to be much older. So that was my first thought. My second thought was that the head looks different. The head is not as weathered and eroded, and it's too small for the body. And I virtually immediately came to my own conclusion. This is all mental now. I wasn't saying anything.
Sure.
That the head was too small for the body. Why? Because it's not the original head. It's been recarved. The original head, which I now believe, and we now have evidence, very clear evidence, it was a lioness. It was the lioness Methead, and I can come back to that. We have evidence for that now only within the last year, based on hieroglyphic inscriptions. But the head was a lion. Even back then, I thought it was probably a lion's head on a lion's body originally, and it had become weathered and eroded. Well, what did they do? They recarved it in dynastic time. So yes, it's a dynastic head from about 2500, 2600 BC, but it's not the original head. So that went through my mind immediately. But in tying in with exactly what you were saying, John Anthony West was very, very frustrated with me because, as he used to say to me and tell other people, he couldn't get a declarative sentence out of me initially because I was very hesitant, because I saw the implications of this. Number one, I realized at a certain level that my academic colleagues were going to push back on it, and I wanted to be very careful and make sure I was not making any mistakes. I wasn't going to go out and have a press conference based on my first observations, my first instincts. So it actually took a number of trips back and forth to Egypt to collect data to really make the case. Something that I insisted on and we raised the money and did was we did geophysics around the Sphinx. So that was done in conjunction with the geophysicist Thomas DeBecke. So Thomas DeBecke and myself, we did geophysics around the Sphinx. Basically what we used was, it's known as seismic techniques. We used a sledgehammer on a steel plate to generate energy waves that penetrate down into the rock and bounce back up, and you can model what's underneath. This was important because I wanted to look at subsurface weathering, subsurface mineralogical changes, which can independently be used to try to calibrate the age of the structure when it was first carved. As a side note, we also found a major cavity, a major chamber under the left paw specifically of the Sphinx, which it turns out, much to my chagrin in some ways, the psychic Edgar Cayce had predicted. I didn't know anything about that. And a lot of people got very excited that we found it. I wasn't quite so excited because, on the other hand, my academic colleagues who aren't into psychics and whatnot, they sort of, they didn't see this as going in my favor, should we say.
That's exactly what I was wondering about, like how you felt at this time, because here you're all about scholarly work, scientific evidence. This is what's important to you. And you see this. And I'm just curious about your thoughts, because now you're about to have to face the world with this.
Yeah, well, from my point of view, for instance, from my point of view, from a scholarly point of view, I shouldn't say scholarly, from an academic point of view, working within the politics of academia, it would have been much easier and much safer and much better for my, should we say, at least short-term career. if I had been able to go over there and prove that John Anthony West was wrong and read a short scholarly paper as to why John Anthony West was wrong and why the conventional Egyptologists were correct, it would have been much easier, too, if I had not found a chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx where this psychic named Edgar Cayce had predicted it, and if I had been able to say, well, no, he may have predicted that, but as we would expect in conventional academia, psychics don't know anything, and I can demonstrate that there really is nothing there. That would have made my life much easier. It turned out that was not the case, and I have to go with the real, genuine evidence, and the real, genuine evidence is that the Sphinx is much older, whether the Egyptologists like to hear that or not, and there really is a chamber where Edgar Cayce predicted there would be a chamber, whether people in, conventional status quo world want to hear that or not. Now, I do want to make it the very clear point with the chamber, which I continue to be very excited about, even a quarter century later, or more than a quarter century later now, because it hasn't been excavated, hasn't been probed. There's been a lot of hubbub about it, but it's never actually been looked into. And I think there's stuff in it. There are things in it. I actually think it's an archive. We now have hieroglyphic evidence just in the last year that refers to it, I believe, as an archive, as a library, a very, very ancient library that goes back, I believe, to prior to dynastic times. But I wanted to make the one point before I forget it. When we found seismically, geophysically, that chamber under the left paw of the Sphinx, I had heard of Edgar Cayce. I wasn't totally naive. I'm pretty up on things. But I didn't know anything about his prophecies. I didn't know anything about his predictions. I did not know he said there was a, quote, hall of records in Egypt anywhere, much less near the Sphinx. So it's not, as some people who have tried to badmouth me from conventional ivory tower academia have said, some have claimed that, I was there to prove him. No, I didn't even know about his prediction along these lines. We found it independently, and it was frankly a thorn in my side academically that he had predicted it.
That's what I figured. I figured it made your life more complicated for sure.
It made it more complicated. I mean, it really did, and it's made things complicated ever since. Even to this day, there's more and more acceptance of the work in academia, especially with independent corroborative evidence like Göbekli Tepe, which you mentioned in the introduction. But on the other hand, there's still a lot of academics, Egyptologists in particular. Egyptologists are the worst in this respect, who don't want to look at the data, do not want to accept the evidence. And I find, too, if I could digress just for a little bit, I'm not alone when it comes to such things and Egyptologists. I don't know if you've spoken on your show about the big void in the Great Pyramid.
No, I was waiting to talk to you about that, actually.
Okay,
I was going to talk to Laird about it, but I decided to wait to talk to you about it.
Yeah, well, I'm probably I don't want to sound the wrong way. I'm probably the one to talk to about it.
No, for sure.
I'm a chief physicist. But the bottom line is, and we can talk more about it if you like, but I wanted to make one point right now, and that is that I've looked at all the raw data for it that I could get my hands on. I'm not involved in the project, so I'm independent of it, but I am a geophysicist. And this study, this data was generated by really top-notch physicists, many of them from Japan, some of them were French, etc. It was a joint international venture. I have no doubt whatsoever that their data, their raw data, is very, very, very good. It's using primarily muography, as it's called, which, we can get into the details if you wanted to. But the bottom line is it's good data. I think they have very good interpretations of it, and all the evidence is that there is a major chamber in the Great Pyramid that was previously undiscovered. Now, the point I want to make at the moment is this is very analogous to me finding something under the Sphinx. What happened in both cases, both the case with me and the case with the big void and the top-notch physicist? the Egyptologists start screaming and kicking, so to speak, and saying it's not there, there's nothing to it, it's nonsense. The latest term that the Egyptologists, the Egyptian Egyptologists, in fact the Ministry of Antiquities was using, is they're calling it propaganda. They can't accept that this is real science, this is real data. They call it propaganda as to dismiss it, and some of them even started calling for the whole project to be shut down. Why? Because they don't like the results. It doesn't fit their scenario. They don't want to be told that there's something new to be discovered. And to me, it's just ridiculous.
I don't understand it.
It really is. I don't understand. Well, I don't understand it from a scientific point of view. I do understand it, having worked in Egypt so long and so been there so often, dealing with people there. It's politics, and it's politics, and it's sort of like, well, if we didn't discover it, it can't be real, and if it doesn't conform to what we've always believed for the last 150 years, well, then it can't be the case, because they're very Egyptologists don't want to change their minds on things. If they believe something as a collective field for the last century, I find they don't want to change. They rather, they're very conservative that way.
But I would think that it would be, especially from a scientific point of view, anytime you find new evidence of something that as marvelous as that, I would think it would be great. That's why I've never understood the politics behind it. I understand that there is politics, but...
Okay, but you just said something, and I don't mean to pick on you, but it's wonderful from a scientific point of view. It's absolutely wonderful from a scientific point of view, but what you have to remember, and a lot of people don't realize this, and I don't mean this in any kind of nasty way whatsoever, what I'm about to say, Egyptologists, on the whole, are not scientists. They are not scientists. They're basically historians. Many of them come from either art history background, or they might come from a linguistics or comparative languages background, or more social political science background, and they also have this concept that if you push things back earlier than dynastic Egypt, somehow it's not Egyptian, even though it's in Egypt. And if you start using scientific data to find new things which they haven't thought of or they aren't aware of, somehow it's stealing Egypt from the Egyptians. I've been accused of this. Oh, you're stealing Egypt from the Egyptians. You're making the Sphinx non-Egyptian. I said, no, it's still Egyptian. It's in Egypt. How do you define Egypt and Egyptian? When I was a graduate student, I couldn't make this stuff up, and it's only significant to me after having experienced Egypt and working in Egypt. But when I was a graduate student, even before I wasn't involved in Egypt at the time, but one of the seminars I took, we just happened to read articles about Egyptology just as case studies, and how Egyptologists were so resistant to using scientific data and incorporating it into their mode of thinking. And I thought this was sort of crazy, and I couldn't really believe Egyptologists were like that. But we read these studies and talked about, the interaction between science and other disciplines, other academic fields. And lo and behold, I've experienced it now in my own career.
Right. Well, you did answer my question. It's not a scientific thing. I just
yeah. And again, I'm an academic, and Egyptology is a legitimate academic field. But a lot of people think Egyptologists are scientists. No, they're not. On the whole, they may use scientific methods, like maybe they send something out for radiocarbon dating, or they're very precise when they're excavating something. In some cases, at least. But it's not inherently science.
Well, it seems to me that the fascinating part about it to me is I studied philosophy and, the mystery schools and all kinds of books. And someone like Plato, who was ahead of his time, obviously way ahead of his time, according to everybody that wrote about Plato, and all of these guys, they they talked about these things. To me, it's really awesome to see that some of it's being validated. Now, I know you bring up the words like, Atlantis and stuff, and that's controversial in itself too. But I mean, that's just a name for I believe, a society that we're discovering that may have been here way before what we know. That's all.
Yeah,
it is.
no, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up Atlantis, because if you hadn't, I would have, if I remembered to. In my career, I did not talk about Atlantis for a number of years. So in the early 1990s, when I was first working with John Anthony West, and this ties in with what you were asking before, how did I view it, what did I say, the implications. Back then, and still to this day, but I'm beyond it now, I just talk about Atlantis, and here we are talking on the radio about Atlantis. Back then, I would not say the word Atlantis publicly, because if you said Atlantis from an academic point of view, if you were a scientist, people tended to dismiss you. They tended to say, oh, he's an Atlantis hunter, ha, 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 and then just dismiss everything you said. And I've never been one for trying to pinpoint Atlantis geographically. What I think is important about the Atlantis story, which Plato, of course, ultimately got from Egypt, is that we're talking about, and Plato was talking about, a very sophisticated society, technological civilization that went back to a very early period. And as you just said, we now have evidence of this. More importantly, and precisely from my point of view, Plato, when you date Atlantis, according to Plato's account, using our modern chronology, Plato dated Atlantis to about 9600 BC, the destruction of Atlantis about 9600 BC. That is within 100 years, the modern geological dating of the end of the Ice Age and the destruction of this earlier cycle of civilization, including the civilization that built the original Sphinx or carved the original Sphinx and built Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, etc., that was destroyed, decimated with the end of the last ice age, 9700 BC. Plato, in a roundabout, estimate, gives 9600 BC. I don't think it's coincidence. I don't think it's just a coincidence that they're so close. I think Plato actually knew what he was talking about, and in particular, the time frame of, how far back this went. It had been passed down with veracity. It was... people knew what they were talking about in classical ancient times when it came to even talking about these earlier cycles, these earlier ancient civilizations.
And there lies a greater mystery. How did they know?
Exactly. How did they know it? What was passed down? I mean, this ties in with something else that I find fascinating. I'm just going to give another example. Go to Australia. The Australian Aborigines, they passed down myths and traditions, whatever people want to call it. And they talk about, for instance, islands off of Australia where their ancestors hunted this or that animal. This was dismissed as absolute nonsense or just, myths that they made up until fairly recently when geology, again, has demonstrated, no, there really were islands out there that really did have certain animals on them, just as the traditions state. But lo and behold, those islands haven't existed for 10, 12,000 years since the end of the last ice age. Yet those traditions have been passed down orally, have been passed down verbally. And it's very easy to, I think, us in our modern literate age to underestimate how strong oral traditions can be and how truthful, how they can pass down real information over what seem like innumerable generations.
All right, so that was Dr. Robert Schoch. So we took a big double back there to learn about ancient history and the Sphinx and that there's a void under there, which is a cool thing, right? So we learned about that from one of the best in his field. So you're seeing a pattern here that we're learning about ancient history, magic, and astral travel from some of the best people and most reputable people in their fields. And the next clip that I want to play is actually from May of 2018. And this is something that I've tried to stress on the show quite a bit, but I don't know if I got my point across. and this was about the Western mystery schools, and who other than Freddie Silva to explain that, what I was trying to get across. And yes, we're going somewhere with this because it's going to go deeper as we go along here. So hang with us here. If you want to join us, we're in Spreaker chat or the Fringe.fm chat if you want to hang out in there as well. But most of us are over on Spreaker. I also dropped the link in there. We're doing the best of 2018. What did we learn and where do we go after this? All right, here we go. Freddie Silva.
The Knights Templar, and I am such a big researcher of ancient mysteries, the mystery schools, esoteric knowledge, and I used to watch these shows how they would talk about the Knights Templar being these evil, devil-worshipping people, and I was like, wait a minute, I thought that these people were, they're the keepers of the mysteries, they were protective of these secrets. I admired them, and I was like, this isn't right. And, and it wasn't too long after that I heard you speaking about, hey, this is what these guys were actually doing. And they were the protectors of this stuff. And this is what they were teaching. It was all about the ancient mysteries. And, if you guys, I recommend you guys go back and listen to that show too on, the Secret Teachings or any show that you've done. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it is a sort of a strange subject, the Templars. I mean, especially if you listen to or watch a certain TV show, which I won't mention on air. It's amazing how much stuff there is out there that bears no resemblance to any reality, and it really comes from the misunderstanding of anything that you're not part of. It's just because something's secret doesn't mean it's nefarious. And when it comes to the Templars, they started off with in a very high esoteric group. They were protecting some very interesting secrets because if you put it into the context of the time of the Middle Ages, the church was very dominant in Europe, and it was hated and feared by just about everybody. So in that context, you had this small group of people who were showing a very, very different way to personal enlightenment. So it must have seemed like nirvana to people at the time, which is why people were giving over all their money to them, which was then held in escrow to be basically awarded to places where it was really needed. So, they built schools, they created a system of welfare for people who needed a sort of a leg up in life. They looked after the sick and the infirm. They taught people how to take care of crops and the land and protect themselves. So it was like the perfect welfare system, except they also came with a spiritual benefit. But of course, the church turned that whole thing around, and their informants who actually penetrated the order later on in their years. And by then, it also had grown to such a point where it became unmanageable. There were a lot of people that were joining the Templars to do some really stupid things. And just like any major organization that grows well above and beyond its boundaries. So there is that towards the end of its 200-year history. But the informants were basically telling the church that they were worshipping some kind of a devil called Baphomet, and that they completely misunderstood what was going on, because if you're an Arab at the time and you mention that to them, they'll say, Baphomet, that means the head or the source of wisdom. And of course, it related to the one thing that the Templars really cared about, and that was the mummified head of John the Baptist, who, of course, was their spiritual leader, or late spiritual leader. And that's all they cared about, because John the Baptist stood for a very long history of people who were indoctrinated into the secret teachings. So for them, he was the end-all and be-all of everything. So the whole thing gets completely turned upside down, that they were worshipping some kind of a devil, and it really was so far from the truth.
Yeah, not to mention that some, the churches of Satan or whatever, they use that symbol, and it triggers people as well. But if you really do the research on it, I think I'm going to put it to you this way. A lot of people say, oh, that guy's a Freemason, or this guy's this and that, and it's got to be some type of secret evil plot going on. But every book I've ever read by any of the ancient Masons or anything about Egypt or the Templars, it's all, the teachings have been just enlightening and beautiful things. So I've never seen what's wrong with any of this stuff. That's just me.
Yeah. Again, it's part of a campaign of deception by people who'd rather have control over you, and they basically turn everything that's good into something that's completely evil, or give it the perception of all that any power that B has to do is put doubt into any situation. It could be about any subject. It could be about politics. It could be about healthcare. It could be anything. All you have to do is put in the doubt, and as soon as people start doubting, they fight amongst each other, and this is how the rich win. And in this case, it really follows that Freemasons, there are two branches of Freemasonry, and the first branch, the oldest, is actually the Knights Templar, who basically changed their name. There was a big PR campaign at the time, around 1312, after they'd been expelled from France, and they basically went underground. They left for Portugal, where they already had lived. In fact, they created the Portuguese nation-state, the first independent nation-state of Europe, which is what my fourth book was all about, really. And then they also went to Scotland, where they had a lot of friends. And when they got to Scotland, they basically changed their name to the Scottish Rite Freemasons after a ceremony on a sacred hill, which was performed on the equinox sunrise, when the main Templar Knight got on top of the hill and greeted Venus before the sunrise, which is a system of initiation, that goes back at least 8,000 years. That's a mark of the risen initiate. Which eventually becomes the symbol of Christianity, even though they also completely misunderstood the original Christian story. But that's for another evening. So basically, the Scottish Rite were actually upholding, and still are upholding, what the Templars were originally teaching. Where it gets a little bit confusing is where suddenly you come up with the London Rite of Freemasonry, which appears in the 18th century, about 1717, I believe. And essentially, from what I'm told from the people on the inside, these people have really very little idea of what it is that they're doing. Some do. Depends on your particular place where you perform your rituals. But they were saying that, most of these people that perform the London Rite have no idea what they're doing or what it is that they're actually mumbling about. It's become a kind of a boys' club for secret handshakes and for doing nefarious things in politics and finance. And so there is some truth to that. I mean, the Skull and Bone Society at Yale is a classic example of alumni who've done some very, very sick things throughout their tenure in government and politics. And then, of course, you have a minority in that who've also done some, pretty nice things, but I have to say they are a minority. So, again, you've got to choose which particular faculty you're working with and also which version of Freemasonry you're working with. But fundamentally, you're right. The teachings are extremely ancient, and they all hark back to a time close to the time of Enoch, the biblical prophet, who was also a person who was very much into the mysteries teachings.
Wow. Yeah, see, that I'm glad that you said all that, because that validates pretty much everything that I've kind of looked at and read, It's and I've got a fella that's messaging me, as soon as he asked me, he said, ask him about Scotland. As soon as he asked that, you started talking about it. So
I just came from there, actually.
Yes, I think it's a great thing, and a lot of the guys that I've met from especially the Scottish Rite Masons were just incredible people. They're all about trying to fix yourself first and then do something good for the planet. But
exactly. And they also allow women into their secrets as well, which is what the real Templars and the real teachings were supposed to be doing. It wasn't a masculine thing. I mean, anything that excludes half the population cannot end well.
Right. And can I ask you? I'm just going to shoot this right out of the gate here, because some of these things have just boggled me throughout time. I grew up a Christian. My dad used to make me read Bible stories. This is way before I got into UFOs. I knew something was up with this. And some of the talks about just some of the sayings, like that saying bridegroom. And I always thought there was something to that. The marriage supper, the wedding, the bridegroom. I always thought this has got to be a deeper, more metaphorical, spiritual thing. And it's not just about whether you're going to heaven or hell,
Oh, absolutely. The whole thing was completely taken out of context. When I began to write The Lost Art of Resurrection, it really came from years of observing temples and how they behave, and some secret rooms that were decreed to be bridal chambers or burial chambers, but no one was ever actually physically buried in them, including the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid and stuff like that. And I began to research early Christianity. I mean, like you, I was raised a Catholic. I didn't have a choice. And then I kind of sort of weed myself out of it because something just didn't feel right. And I went back to the original Christian doctrine, which were the Gnostic Christians. And these people were following essentially the Buddhists, and then they were following the Zen masters of China. We're talking about different people following the same principle over thousands of years. And it turns out that when you start reading what Jesus was saying in the Bible, and a lot of the passages that make no sense whatsoever in the Bible, through an esoteric point of view, and certainly from the initiation language, it makes absolute sense. In fact, it's amazing that the church was giving so much information away as though they expected to be caught red-handed one day. The bridegroom is a wonderful moment because it talks about how, the final act of initiation, this is after 3 years when you've actually learned, the really big secrets of initiation and how to leave the body consciously, how to control the electrical nervous impulses of your body, and also control the use of emotion, and specifically controlling fear. That was always a big moment in your initiation. And you were given all of these incredible trials to really bring out the worst fears in you, and you had to control it. Fear is an extraordinary tool to basically control vast sums of people. If you can learn to control that within yourself, now you're basically on top of the world. So it turns out that throughout the world where you had these ceremonies for the final act of initiation, the initiate had to marry a bride, which, of course, I got very excited about this. This is all very romantic. But it turns out that he or she would always marry this person in a dark chamber or in a cave or in a man-made mountain, always in the dark. And I'm thinking, is this woman really ugly? I mean, why is this woman always get married in the dark? It turns out that, and I'd love to know how they figure this out, because it goes back to at least prehistoric times, where our ancient predecessors, they figured out that, before everything existed, before time, before light, before sound, before the Big Bang, there existed a creator God. And this creator God must have been a pretty intelligent person, because it basically knew everything that exists. Otherwise, how could it not create the universe if it didn't know a heck of a lot of stuff? So they basically reasoned that this creative force was best exemplified by a feminine force, because a feminine force is expansive. It gives birth. So they figured, let's basically take this woman and we'll paint her black, because she basically hides in the dark, because there's still no light, there's no sound, there's the universe. In the beginning, there was just darkness. So this divine woman resides in the dark. She is a divine virgin, and essentially they used her as the metaphor for the woman that the initiate marries once he or she crosses into the other world, completely alive, by the way. It was actually a very dangerous induced out-of-body experience. Some people actually left the body for 7 days, walked about in the other world. They learned all kinds of extraordinary material. And then, I'm talking about shamanism. I'm talking about something way above and beyond shamanism here. And basically, when they achieved the goal of acquiring this specialist knowledge, they were said to marry this divine bride, who was a black woman. And of course, we know this very well in medieval Europe, because she's called the Black Madonna. So there's nothing about her coming from Ethiopia or being from the Sudan or being black-skinned. It's just that it's all about metaphors. You're absolutely right. Everything is always about metaphors. So once you understand the metaphor of the Black Virgin and the bride and who's married with the bridegroom inside the bridal chamber, it was essentially the metaphor for the initiation chamber, where they performed the biggest secret of all. And 3 to 5 days later, you come back into your body a little bit groggy, and the person who was actually in charge of this most important part of your initiation was usually a woman, which is why the church basically turned on the women when they took power. And why Mary Magdalene was given such a bad shrift in history. It was because it was a patriarchal system taking over from a matriarchal system, which had been done for at least 8,000 years, as the records show. And basically this woman took you on a mound, and the first thing you saw was Venus rising above sunrise at the spring equinox, and you declared risen from the dead. And the phrase is actually very telling, because it's also a bit of a joke. The initiates will always look at people who go through life. If they're not really awakened, they have a mundane life. It's painful. It's full of superstition and gossip. And they would literally be described as the dead. But the moment you discover the knowledge of the universe, the mechanics of nature, and learn to apply those in real life, you are now the living. In fact, in the Hindu culture today in India, they still refer to the unawakened people as the corpses. So there's a bit of a joke here at the expense of the unenlightened, but it's not derogatory. It's just a way that they have a bit of humor.
Wow. I wonder if that's what Christ meant when he said, follow me, right? And he said, let me bury my brother, right? And he said, let the dead bury the dead, right?
Yeah.
I think that's exactly what he's talking about.
I am the way. Basically, he gives away his biggest level of initiation, because when you're following the way, you're following a tradition that goes back to Japan in 8,000 BC, and it's called the 17 Ways. We call this the Tao, or the Tao in Western culture now. And essentially, it's 17 rules by which you come to learn to become your spiritual self. And it's rather interesting, going back to our conversation about the Scottish Rite Freemasons, that their highest and most important spiritual level is the 17th degree, which is it's called the night of the east and the west. So basically it's referring to the equinox. When you basically come to understand light and dark in equal balance, you are holding that balance within yourself. You're not too lighty, you're not too dark either. You hold that fine balance, and a person that understands the difference between the two is truly enlightened.
See, this is incredible stuff. This information, it seems to be understood by more people now than it did, obviously, back then. Do you think it's time? I mean, do you think they planned on having, I guess, all of this information come out now during this age?
Oh, I think it goes up and down through history. I mean, the more I look back at this and the more I research it, the more I find that there are opportune times when you put your head over the castle wall, and there are times when you duck down. I think the initiates got tired of being burnt alive and boiled to death and having nails put through them and stuff like that. They basically realized that there are some times when you just have to lie low. And this is why the use of metaphor and symbol was so important. Like, again, in medieval Europe, there were the Rosicrucians, there was the Invisible College,
right.
There was the Templars, there was all kinds of interesting people going around. And they basically communicated with each other through symbols, through metaphors, through parables, like Jesus used to do. So that's, on one level, most people would see this as pure entertainment. But on another level, people who are a little bit more aware and curious, they'll read between the lines and go, wait a minute, that means something else. I mean, the classic one, of course, is the stories of the Grail that the Templars were proposing all around through Europe, and it was all to do with the story of a knight who gets mortally wounded. He goes on a quest to overcome 12 obstacles, and at the end he marries this divine bride. I mean, that's a story of Isis and Osiris. It's a story of Jason and the Argonauts, literally rewritten for a different age, and that's how they got away with it. So again, today they're coming out of the shadows again, and have been for the last at least 30, 40 years. There's been a huge rise in this sort of so-called New Age movement, except it's not really New Age. It's quite old age. And the people who actually follow this kind of work are actually, there's more of us than there are of them. I mean, when I travel around the world, I go to places that you've never even heard of in Ohio. And believe me, in rural conservative Ohio, I have a lot of people coming out and filling in very large rooms. And it gives me a lot of confidence that people, like you and I, are thinking the same way, and that we just don't attract attention. I mean, let's face it, when was the last time good news was presented on television or in the newspaper? It's pretty rare to hear good news.
Yeah.
So, and it's not done nefariously. They just have to sell newspapers. They realize that tension creates headlines and creates interest, and that sells newspapers. I worked in media for many years, and I finally came to the conclusion that there's not really a nefarious thing behind all these headlines, unless, of course, you're talking about certain right-wing groups that are taking over most of the media in this country, and I mean America, by the way. There's one particular group called Sinclair that owns 72% of the news outlets, and there's nothing, the propaganda, it has nothing to do with news, and this is a very dangerous time. So the antidote to that, of course, are the teachings. And there's a lot of people who basically are, they're keeping an eye on what the snakes are doing, because you've got to keep an eye on what the snakes are up to. Otherwise, you basically are ignorant of life around you. But at the same time, you don't have to buy into it. And, you go to the right conferences, you read the right books, and then you basically follow your own little path and, tend your own garden. And that's the way it's always been done. You do what you can, where you can, and then see what effect that does. And some people will get it, and some won't, and that's the way it's always going to be. It's called Earth. This is a big school. It's always going to be a big school. You can't fix it. It's just the way it is.
There's no doubt about that. That's for sure. I think that, and like I was mentioning earlier, I bring up the Bible a lot. That's because it's really one of the only books that was pounded into me. But, he talked about, if you see the man carrying the pitcher of water, come up into the upper room and I'll meet you there, right? And I used to ask my father, Freddie, I said, Dad, why would Jesus be talking about some guy walking down the street carrying a pitcher of water? why is that written in a gospel? Why is that important? And he would just be like, oh, the Lord works in mysterious ways. Well, if if you look at the symbol of that, well, that's Aquarius, right? Like,
yeah.
And then I don't know if we're in this age or not, but I wonder if he was talking about, because some people say we are, some people say we're not. But I was wondering, maybe it goes deeper than that. Is he talking about an age where people start waking up, or is he talking about something deeper? And this is what fascinates me. Books like Manly P. Hall and people that, are into occultism. And when I say occultism, that means they look into the meaning of things more than what it is on the surface. That's all,
Yeah, I mean, occult means hidden from the eye or hidden from view. Kind of like heretic, which originally meant someone in possession of the facts who's able to choose. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, sure. And let's go there. Now you have a book about crop circles. You're into symbolism. I mean, a man that is intelligent as you are about the mystery schools. And by the way, everything you said about fear and all that stuff lines up exactly with what I can tell you. I'm going to tell you about that after the next break. But you have a book about crop circles. You're into symbolism. You're into ancient monuments and stuff. And I had a conversation with John Anthony West about this, that these things triggered our subconscious, and that I've always thought that, or looked at the subconscious as the doorway to being able to speak with this other realm,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's always been said that the sign of an advanced civilization lies in its ability to encode a library of information into a simple symbol. The hieroglyphs are great examples. I mean, you can read them left to right, right to left, up to down, down to up. You can interpret them literally or metaphorically or symbolically. You can also feel them. They're also energetic forms, and you can work with them in healing. I talk about multifaceted, and that was one of the things that really helped us to kind of crack the crop circle code in its early days. I mean, there's a lot of stuff nowadays that's actually man-made, unfortunately, but in the early days of the phenomenon, when it was really quite real and very serious, there's a lot of information that was used for technology. For example, there's one particular symbol which I actually used for the front cover of the book, and I knew exactly what it does. That's why I put it there, and we were told in those uncertain terms that it was to do with the manipulation of gravity, that people would be used or have suggestions put into their heads that they would design these anti-gravity devices. And I can say that there are three groups of people, one in England, one in America, and one in Australia, who have used the blueprint for that crop circle, and they have built anti-gravity devices, and they work. They're just waiting for the right political moment to bring this out to the public. As you know, even people who developed water-based cars have a habit of dying mysteriously all of a sudden. So, again, they've learned, you wait for the right moment, you keep it underground, you tell the right people, and slowly, by the time the powers that be find out about it, it'll be too late, because we'll probably all have one. But it's an incredible phenomenon, and I mean, I kind of describe them as living temples, because they are built exactly the same principles as a pyramid or as a Stonehenge. The only difference is that they're made with pressed crop. And they have a very high spiritual content. Some of the symbols we actually use in the healing arts, which is extraordinary. So it's a fascinating topic, and probably the most important phenomenon that's happening in our time. And I think it's quite timely too, given what we're going through right now. We're in the middle of huge changes, and of course we all get a little bit of help from outside sources, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
At certain times, and it's always happened through history. This is their way of basically saying, we're kind of like guardian angels. You do have them. We see that humanity is going to go through some serious trouble up ahead, and here are some symbols that we're going to present to you. Of course, you have to figure it out, but we'll also be using people to write books and do the right thing and put the information out there to get the ball rolling, and that's exactly what's happened. In fact, when I remember back in the days when I was, I really did not want to write a book about crop circles. I was doing quite well, earning a living doing something else. I didn't want to become a poor author, and it turns out that the book becomes a bestseller, and the rest is history. And I've been on, I've been talking about this now for 15 years without stopping. So I guess someone was actually looking after me as well. But it's interesting how during these times, these symbols have begun to turn people around, and they are, I believe, inherent in the changes that we're now going through, and we're actually applying the information from those symbols, which then leads us to the concept of of ancient temples, and why suddenly we're more interested in temples than at any other point in living history. I mean, for the last 2,000 years, we've been destroying these things, and suddenly everybody wants to go to an ancient temple. And I think that's part of this subconscious awakening that's going on, and it's all triggered by all of these symbols that are being laid down across the face of the earth.
Do you think we'll ever get back there, Freddie? Like, we'll ever get back to that place or that they had in maybe in 8,000 BC where we were wanting to learn these things and we could get back to that technology? I think we're headed in kind of the wrong direction with this artificial intelligence stuff, and I think the technology they understood was totally different.
It was a technology that was based on the understanding of nature. In fact, I'm writing a new book on this right now about a missing civilization that basically went under the water in 11,000 BC. And the more I travel around the world, the further away I get from Europe and go to places that don't get much attention, the more I understand from the indigenous people just how wrong we've been about everything. For example, I didn't realize that in South America, in the Andes, and there's a few people left of the Aymara and the Bukina up in near Lake Titicaca, and they still talk about Mu, the continent, in classrooms. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. I mean, if you do to teach that in Europe or in the Western world, you'd lose your license because it's supposed to be a myth. To them, it's not a myth; it's a real event, and and they trace their culture back to these people who were unusual. They were very tall. They certainly knew about the arts of moving rocks through the air, and you had the same story all around the world. So, I think that they knew the understandings of the mechanics of nature, and they knew how to control them. But by the same token, if you read the Vedas in India, they also talk about the wars of the gods. How some of these people, thought that this was a good thing, and sometimes too much of a good thing can get to your head, and there were the wars of the gods, and there were descriptions of what sound like nuclear disasters. So they too also lost the plot, and so that culture also had to die. So in a way of, if you look at the big picture, I would say that probably natural catastrophes and meteorite strikes upon the Earth are part of the big picture of how we also as a consciousness influence the universe around us, and we bring calamity upon ourselves to restart the clock. So I think that we are where we need to be today for a good reason. I think we have to learn something. I think you can be enlightened at any moment in your life if you choose to. I don't think we need an age to do that in. I mean, in the middle of some of the worst atrocities in Europe, in the Middle Ages, we had the Templars creating these oases of enlightenment. So I think it's always been there. It's always still here. We just get sort of turned away from it because there's so many different things that catch our eye today, like texting and sticking to your cell phone and not getting away from it. And I mean, I watch people that go on my tours, and the rule that I have is no cell phones, no texting. We are here to get back to a world before our own. And believe me, they have a hard time for the first 2 days to put those things down. But after a week of being out in the middle of the fields and engaging with big stones, and sometimes having extraordinary experiences, when they get back to the airport, it's really jarring for them. They realize how jarring the modern world really is. And within a year, they'll write back to me and say, that trip changed my life, and I've changed my life too. And I've taken on a new form of looking at things, and I've adapted to things. And not always easy, because you have to change your life in innumerable ways. But at the same time, the fringe benefits end up being very good. So I think enlightenment is what it is to the individual. I think we can be enlightened at any particular moment that we choose to. We don't need a mass movement for that, and I think the journey is a very personal one. And the Egyptians were talking about that as well a long time ago. They said that we go through ages where everything is appropriate, and it may seem difficult, but those difficulties are there for a reason. They are there to remind you of something that you've lost that you once cherished. So it's not a matter of going backwards and looking at things with rose-colored glasses, because things were also bad back then. It's just that sometimes the good things tend to stick out more than others after a period of time had gone past. It's kind of looking back at Mayberry and all the films of the 50s in America, and wondering, wow, the 50s was such a great time. But most of the people that talk about that, they went in the 50s, and they didn't realize that every other week there'd be a drill to go into a bunker because they were testing for nuclear weapons. So there was a threat of nuclear war in the 50s, which sounds pretty horrible. But, we tend to look back and think, the 50s must have been fantastic in America with the Fonz and all of that, and the happy days.
The music was good.
And the music was great. But, so were the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, I think we just have to choose what we focus on, and then that's what makes our lives so much better.
So I hope you're starting to see a pattern here. That was Freddie Silva. I believe that was back in May of 2018, either May or March, I forget. And so we're doing the best of 2018, a year in review. And what have we learned and where do we go from here? I may do another one of these tomorrow night because, like I said, it was really hard to pick from all of these. And so we've talked about astral travel and magic with Dr. Dean Radin. We also talked to Thomas Campbell. We've talked to Freddie Silva about ancient history, Dr. Robert Schoch about how it's all messed up, and he even brought up the word Atlantis, which is really cool, which he never thought he would. But now we're going to just kind of leap forward really quick, and we're going to go into July of 2018, and this is where, as far as magical power goes, gets a little bit controversial. But I want you to think about what we've learned and what possibly the human potential is and what they've been hiding as you listen to this. This is going to be Gordon White from July 31st, 2018.
You know, and you've already spoken earlier about grays and things like that. So or at least you have a feeling that all this stuff is connected, right? I mean, it definitely is, I think. You know, as far as ufology, I think there's some connections there.
If magic is real, and it is, then the universe by definition is magical. I happen to think it runs on it. We're coming back to that sort of spirit idea. And this is just you can say this is just a romantic or metaphorical way of redescribing idealism or whatever. Maybe so. As a result, there is nothing. I think the majority of what we currently call UFO encounters, particularly when it comes to quote-unquote abductions or experiences, are much better described in this kind of wider magical model because it fits so perfectly into historical accounts of fairy encounters or incubus and succubi demons and all the other kind of stuff you get all over the world to do with these mysterious different kinds of entities, and the fact that because they're real, occasionally they, interact with mankind. That appears to be the story of the human journey. Now, I had Richard Dolan on the podcast the other week, and aliens, quote unquote real aliens, is in physical organisms in mechanical craft visiting the planet. I'm assuming, it seems like a very good thing to assume that has happened at least once in the history of mankind. So aliens still exist in a magical universe. That's the thing. Aliens presumably have an afterlife. I would suspect it's the same afterlife. I think that's one of the reasons why when you go on an ayahuasca journey or mushrooms or whatever, it does, particularly with mushrooms, it does in fact feel quite alien. I think, like McKenna does, that the psilocybin mushroom itself probably came from off planet because the spores can survive in space. So it definitely hangs together, and part of the journey of, once we dismiss all the 20th century stuff and 19th century stuff, is finding a satisfactory way. I don't think it's a thing you can solve. I think on a macro level, I don't think the universe gets solved, or otherwise what's the point of it? But I do think there are more satisfying frameworks or foundational ideas that we can have that allow us to compare notions like UFOs and magic and fairies and whatever, and see if these comparisons yield interesting results and ideas. And I think we're at that point. I think the 21st century is going to be based, the magical cosmologies will be based more in that almost empirical psi data and an understanding of UFOs and all that kind of stuff. I think that's where it gets based. And it doesn't mean that's the answer. It just means that that's the framework from which we can probably think in a more satisfactory way.
Yeah, it's a lot better for progress, I believe, and to think that way too. So here's my next question. There's a lot of, I get on Discord and I talk to a lot of people about magic. It's a very talked about subject nowadays, and there's this idea of danger. Half of the people that I've talked to, magicians even, say magic isn't dangerous at all. And then other ones say that it is. And then the ones that are just curious about it definitely worry about the danger. So is magic, or practicing magic, is it dangerous, so to say?
100%. But if the universe is magical, you exist in a universe where magic exists. So deciding not to do it doesn't make you safe. You have done a risk analysis because other people can perform it on you. You could have spirits messing with your life, all the other kind of stuff that happens in every other culture except ours, and it did happen in ours. Like, we had an awareness of this up until a couple of centuries ago. Every other culture in all time, for all time, knows that this is just the nature of the universe. There are things like spirits and magic and whatever exist. So is it more dangerous to... You can't not take a position. Is it more dangerous to not be doing it? And I just mean simple stuff like warding your house. You can go to any Botanica and get like a nice house protection kit. You're doing magic if you do that, but I would genuinely recommend it. Again, I don't think you need to. You're obviously very interested in it as well, Joe, and it can be a lifelong passion and pursuit. I think maybe that's the case for 1 in 100 people, but for the other 99, magic's still real and it can still impact their lives. So what you do tend to find in, dare I say, wiser or more experienced cultures, and I would include regional Italy today in this, with an understanding of things like the evil eye. They're all, God-fearing Catholic women, but they do still have techniques in which to make sure that the house is safe or that the food is blessed or so on, because that's the game. So is magic dangerous? 100%. But life is a terminal condition, and I'm not sure it is any less dangerous to not do magic.
That makes sense, because I could go into that, but more so I'd like to go into curses and psychic attacks. Now, from my experience, and I truly believe this, and that it's somewhat real. I know that, like you say, when I've done protection things, or I've got this course I promote from Frater Xavier that's about protection, and it works. I haven't had any of those experiences since I've used it, but is that all in my mind, or what's the difference? How about this? Is curses and psychic attack, is that stuff real?
Sure. The danger there, I think you slipped back into that Cartesian mind-matter error, which suggests and diminishes the reality of things that happen in your mind. And that is not how the rest of the world, when it comes to magic, operates. So, yes, they absolutely do work. Yes, you absolutely can curse people without them knowing about it. I have people who, I don't want to say do it as a job, but that's a speciality they have. This stuff is, it would not surprise me, given the kind of weird stuff that I bumped up against in my, I guess, corporate life in London. It would not surprise me if there aren't people like that on retainer for certain companies. I mean, the US military certainly spent millions looking for it during the Cold War, same for the Soviets. So where did all that research go? So yes, absolutely that stuff. Absolutely that stuff. I don't want to say it's not a thing to be scared of necessarily, because again, there are other things in the world other than humans, so people tend to focus more on someone's cursing me or whatever. That does happen. So that happened to my partner in when we were in London. He was working for a department store, and he was running a section of it, and he had to fire this woman who was basically a workplace bully, unbelievably lazy, but also a workplace bully and just a very nasty person, and she would make other staff members cry. Anyway, she's Nigerian, and we lived in West London, and West London's very, multicultural or whatever. And London has a problem with the Nigerian understanding of witchcraft at the moment. A few people have died from exorcisms and so on. But nevertheless, this woman went and got 2 of her friends and attempted to curse him. But yes, myself, I saw that off. But that does happen. So not that common. Be careful if you're firing someone. Make sure she's not a witch, I guess. But that's less. Let me put it this way. The generalized uplift in your home happiness and even just luck and sense of well-being by just doing a house protection on a semi-regular basis, or again, really simple off-the-shelf stuff, should tell you that you probably didn't break a curse that someone was throwing at you, but it's more the other stuff that happens in the universe that's filled with spirits and all this other kind of thing. That tends to be more. And this is what original proper shamanism, not how we understand it in the West, is very much about. It's about keeping the negative spirits away from the village or away from the hunting group, and removing the ones that have kind of started to infect you or taken parts of your soul. So it's a very medical approach to getting rid of these, problematic term, but whatever, non-physical entities whose job it is, or whose function in life is to sort of feed off you, or maybe they cause drama just because they feel like it. And because humans are themselves spirits, we just happen to have a body at the moment, and we're actually quite powerful ones. Once you assert sovereignty over your own power as a spirit, like once you actually protect your home, you're in the game now, but also you are more potent than the majority of kind of background spirits that may be interacting with your life in a way that you're unaware of. So, yeah, curses are real. Curses aren't as big of an issue unless you're actually in the business of magic, you get a lot of them, but curses aren't that big of a deal for most people in the West, but nevertheless, you will still be better off using protection, given that spirits exist. Put it that way.
When you say like some of this stuff could be just because we're in this realm of spirits, it could be other things. Do you mean like, self-inflicted curses or bad planetary alignments or all kinds of different things?
Yeah, there are different ways to moderate astrological effects, and it sort of goes on a chart-by-chart basis there. But yes, if you look at how the theory of mind works in many non-Western cultures, if you are in despair or you experience a trauma or any of that kind of stuff, if a bad thing happens, or if you're really low and entertaining really awful, maybe even suicidal thoughts or so on, you've either got something riding you, or you open yourself up to it. You open yourself up. There are things out there. It's kind of like cutting your leg with a knife and then walking into the sea at sunset. You're going to get some sharks. And because we don't think this stuff is real, we must look like idiots to these to sort of Amazonian shamans, because here we are opening ourselves up to negative effects and then experiencing them, and it's like, what are you doing? So yes, there's so much of it is a dare I say a head game, but you don't even need to have. This is why I like performance of it, but I like ritual, if you will, or the performative aspect of magic before the theory, because it doesn't necessarily matter which of those things is in play or which combination of those things is in play. You still should ward your house. That just should be a thing, especially if you've got kids and whatever. Just kind of think of it as responsible household management, because that's how we lived.
Right.
And I mean, even Europeans, that's how we lived forever, as far back as I can see. And my first book traces these practices back 100,000 years. So we've got this 200. Do you honestly think, is it just possible that for whatever it is, 11% of the population over the last 200 years versus the rest of the population forever, is it just possible we might be wrong? Like, do you think maybe there's something to this? And that's enough to go, okay, that's convinced me, I'm going to go and do. And again, we spoke about this during the break. I appreciate people come from different religious backgrounds, so that they might be. You don't need to go full witchcraft on any of this stuff to ward your house. In fact, the majority of these techniques are very Christian. They rely on saints and so on. And in fact, you get the sort of Hand of Fatima approach in Islam as well. So it's not even like, and same thing with Judaism. So it's not even like you're. I'm not asking you or suggesting you step outside a spiritual cosmology that you are comfortable with, which is fine. Like, the reality is the majority of European magic is Christian and has been for 2,000 years. It really is things like saints and herbs and using objects that have been blessed in church and all that kind of stuff. We think it's demonic, or we think it's some survival of paganism. It isn't. It's kind of unofficial Christianity, I guess, is a better way of describing it. So it is your legacy as a person speaking English now. You don't have to use it, but it belongs to you. It's a thing that you can do, and it can fit in whatever you feel comfortable. And I actually like people to be a bit uncomfortable, but magic is not a separate religious cosmology that requires you to depart the faith of your fathers, right? It's found in every spiritual system, because it is not a religion so much as it is a way of actualizing your kind of innate powers as a human. So it belongs anywhere. And if you're a bit squeamish about it from a religious perspective, that's fine. Trust me, whatever your religion is, you will find some protection magic in it. I promise there isn't a religion on the planet that doesn't have it.
Well, I always wondered why, when Christ put his hands in the, with the Rosicrucians, they call him the master, right? But Christ put his hands in the dirt, then rubbed the guy's eyes. Like, why didn't he just rub the guy's eyes? Why did he have to? It seemed like there was something there that they didn't really talk to us about.
A lot of the stuff, a lot of the Jesus stories, and the reason they cut a lot of these stories out is because the accusations of people against the Christian apologists and church fathers in the early days of the church was that he's just a magician. Mm-hmm. Like, look at the stuff he's doing. He's like spitting in people's mouths and doing like actual witchcraft to remove demons and spirits and so on, which, by the way, the removal or exorcism of, dare I say, evil spirits, whatever you want to call them, is the fundamental Christian magical technology. So when I'm talking about house protection, like, it is a do as I do pronouncement. Like, Jesus did it. Like, it is the fundamental magical technique that Christianity gave to Europe, is the banishing of or removal of evil spirits from either a person or a place. And several of them have survived the whitewashing of Jesus's crazy magical powers into the Bible today. But there are so many more. There's some great books like Jesus the Magician that actually compiles them, and all these stories of what was happening. That's the idea that it is non-Christian or anti-Christian is historically incorrect. And the rules or strictures against the practice of astrology and magic that the church, in an uneven way over the course of the first millennium, brought down on Europe, were actually inherited from Rome. So Rome had very strict rules about astrology and magic because they knew it was real and they needed it. Like, official magic was allowed, but you couldn't do, and this survives to the modern day, like, you couldn't cast natal charts for the emperor because you'd learn stuff about him that you could use against him. And so Rome was really squeamish about magic because they knew it worked. And obviously Christianity kind of became Rome. For a while there, it became a bunch of other stuff because it's been around for 2,000 years. But for a while there, because it kind of inherited the Roman legal set, essentially, a lot of the rules that we think are kind of Christian to do with being squeamish around magic, they inherited from pagans, funnily enough.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I get into this with people. I find as a host, I've had some of my mentors say, "Oh, Joe, you've got to go down the middle of the road. You have to stay middle pathway. You can't take sides on these things." But sometimes it's very hard to bite my tongue when a lot of people get dragged through the mud. Like when you this is besides religion, but when you see like Alex Jones and these people talking about spirit cooking and all this other stuff, and they want to put every person that's ever practiced magic in that category, or Alex Jones really using that word, occultist, like, he says, I know what it means. It's not a bad thing, but why does he scream it and look like he's angry when he says it? There's something else going on that's trying to keep us from knowing our potential, I believe. I don't know what it is.
There's kind of two things there. On a cosmic level, absolutely. On a cosmic level, anything that can kind of, it's sort of a Gnostic idea, and it's probably a bit true, and I don't know how, that you can call it whatever you want, archons, demiurge, the evil one, what have you. There is something very unusual about the universe in that even though magic works, one, it doesn't work very often, and two, it's frowned upon by official powers wherever you are in the world. And official powers are very often an expression of the demiurge or the evil one or whatever you want to call it. So, yes, in Alex Jones's case, conspiracy in America, I don't have a lot of put it this way, most American Protestantisms aren't Christian, as far as I can see. I call it churchianity, as does Dr. Farrell, for that reason. You kind of can't take the documents out of context, and this is a side effect of the Protestant Revolution, but you can't take the document out of context and pick one translation and decide that's the real one, even though it's this melange of documents from more than 2,000 years ago, because it's got the Old Testament in it. But also you can't pull it out of the rigorous analysis that the church fathers and people like Thomas Aquinas gave it, and then remove the rituals as well, which are actually all magical. Like if you look at the earliest baptism rituals, they are a ritual replay of Genesis, because the priests will
Oh, man, I lost him. Hold on just a second. Let me get him back. That stinks. We got to take a break anyways, but I'll be right back, guys. That was getting good, too. This live show that happens. We'll be right back. We're going to get Gordon back on.
Ahoy there, Gigi here.
And I'm Cortana, and we're here to take you on a journey through all things paranormal, metaphysical, ufology, and even psychedelic on our show.
Ship Happens, live every Friday night from 7 to 9 Pacific. That's 9 to 11 Central, right here on The Fringe FM.
And remember, don't feed the Archons, feed ducks instead.
Duck up.
Here. Don't know what happened. A little internet glitch there, I guess. But hey, I want to tell you guys too, if you guys go to magicalegypt.com, you know the series, and you get the code word is Fringe, and you get 10% off. That code word is still good, but you might want to hold up. They're working on the website. Something went wrong, I believe, with their system. I know Daryl told me about it, so I checked it today, and we're both working on it. So if you had ordered that, please let me know. And you put the code word in, and you didn't get your Magical Egypt series or whatever it was that you ordered, and you didn't get the 10% off, let me know. We're going to get that fixed. It may take a few days, but we're working on that. Okay, so we're here with Gordon White, podcast host, author, awesome dude, intellectual, magician. One of the most fascinating conversations I've had on here so far, and I'm totally in agreeing with you when it comes to the history of Christianity. It was, I bought this book, and I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's a big, thick book called the Gnostic Bible. Are you familiar with that?
I am indeed.
And I'm looking at this stuff, and I'm like, what? This is like night and day, compared to what I've been shown. And this is much older stuff, stuff that's like, if this is the origins of Christianity, then perhaps we're all wrong. So when you say head trauma, I really believe it.
Yeah, and the thing is, it really is. A lot of those documents, Gospel of Thomas is probably older than any of the synoptics. And if you look at the history of how they've tried to date the kind of official Gospels, it's nonsense. It's nonsense that's been put together. Call it a conflict of interest. So they're trying to make these as old as possible. So they kind of have to, they know Matthew's the oldest, and they've got to push that back because it mentions the destruction of the temple. So they figure, okay, well, we'll make that a couple of years after it. And because the others are so reliant, not John, but the other two are so reliant on Matthew that, okay, well, that must have been AD 90 and that one's AD 95. And the first physical documents or other references to them are 130 years later. So here after Nag Hammadi and so on, we have documents that are older. And what's amazing to me about them, Gospel of Thomas in particular, and Gospel of Mary, is you are looking at a channeled document. These early Christian, bear in mind there was no monolithic Christianity for centuries. It's not even like they've sort of firmed it up in the first few years. For centuries. You get into the 5th century and it's still a mess, right? But in those first couple of centuries, it was crazy in the Near East in a delightful way. They're using Greco-Egyptian Hermetic words of power to kind of elevate up through the spheres to meet Jesus face to face. And there's a clear understanding that this entity, and I was saying to you on the break, when I realized that Jesus, I'm a mythicist, when I realized that Jesus the gospel story isn't history. It didn't happen physically. When I realized it's a non-physical being, that's kind of when I almost became a Christian, essentially, because I'm like, I can work with this. It goes back to our earlier discussion of the fact that I assert a fundamental reality or ontology to the imaginal and to ideas and to the things that are in there. And if you look at the Gospel of Mary, that's just like it's the smoking gun as far as I'm concerned. She is talking to Jesus, and Peter doesn't believe her, and she starts crying and says, do you think I made this up? Like, do you think that this is just in my head? I'm like, well, wait a minute, Peter. If Jesus is in a room talking to Mary, what do you mean you don't believe her? But if Jesus isn't in the room, if Mary is talking to Jesus in some kind of channeling capacity, then the document makes sense, right? Then Peter's like, I don't believe you. I think you made it up. And that's also, you get the kind of sexist power play of what's happening there. And it's kind of why I like esoteric Christianity, because in the story of the Magdalene and so on, you have what happens to powerful women when there's a power vacuum and lesser men try to assert control. So there's really a lot of interesting stuff in things that didn't physically happen. Something Tolkien said, right, is myths describe things that never happened but always are. And I think that is a very profound spiritual truth when it comes to looking at something like the Jesus story. And if you and it is for me anyway. So if you're looking for ways to have that be enriched or reanimated or re-enchanted for you, for me that was it.
Yeah, it's more than just, in my opinion, what they call Christ consciousness, which was a good start, I think, to understand that. But I think it's so much more than that. It's a physical being. It is a separate being. It's a sort of personification of the Logos, which is this Greco-Jewish idea of the kind of animate or ordering principle of the universe. And in that sense, it redeems it, because the Logos redeems chaos. Without it, the universe turns to mush, right? And the Jesus entity appears to be what the Logos looks like when it gets close to mankind. Because if you look at the long list of documents that were going to go into the Bible, there's the sort of Shepherd of Hermas prayer, which is clearly about Orion, the actual star system, as the kind of redeeming shepherd. And this is because in the early centuries or so, people made less of a distinction because they hadn't been taught that it had to physically happen. This kind of dumbing down into it needs to be a collection of historical events emerges as a sort of requirement of the Roman Empire once it goes Catholic, and they need to shut down all these competing claims. But it wasn't at the time. Like the early Christians were magicians, basically. Well, this is so validating for me about a lot of things. I'm glad that I've seen it in a simple, hey, a little aha way, but you've really dug into this stuff. That's impressive. And by the way, Liz is in the chat room saying this is an interesting show. Said she's been listening. I'm glad to see you in the chat. But if Gordon, I would really go check out his podcast too, because it's just filled with this stuff. It's at runesoup.com. And I want to talk about something that I got to get off the table here, because when I first started talking about magic on the show, I was approached in mass quantities of this whole black versus white magic, left wing versus right wing. These are actual black magicians, and I mean real labels, like they would put people in categories. And I'm thinking, to me, spirituality, magic is magic. So what is your opinion on the ethics of magic, or is there ethics per se?
Does gravity have ethics? Like, does gravity have a morality, or do you have to bring a morality to it? As for like left-hand path, right-hand path, or black magic, white magic, to a tremendous extent, this is one of those 19th century ideas we need to get rid of, because what tended to happen was that they would accuse each other. Crowley was famous for this, to accuse each other of being a black brother or something, and because they didn't like the particular stuff they were doing. And there's a tremendous amount of Victorian squeamishness to do with particularly non-white magic that comes from non-white races that they didn't like. So they liked Egyptians, they liked Indians, both of which were imperial assets at the time. But they didn't necessarily on the fence about some Chinese stuff, but African, no. New Guinean, no. These are savages, and they have the savage cannibals and all this kind of stuff. So contained within this left-hand path, right-hand path is a very dangerous racist 19th century view of the world. That being said, so remove those ideas. Once you get out, because we don't have a functioning system of lineage when it comes to magic. That being said, in the actual history of European magic, which is grimoires, but also everywhere else in the world, you have people that specialize in it. So there is a difference between a sorcerer and, say, a mystic or magician or what have you. Pretty much same thing with witch, pretty much everywhere. And it's one of the concerns I have with, although I love the idea of people seizing an image or an archetype that is very empowering. If you look at the current sort of Brooklyn middle-class white girl understanding of a witch as some sort of feminist icon, that is the whitest nonsense I've ever heard, because everywhere else in the world it is a bad word for people doing bad things. And not just that, because the witch is this figure that there are some accounts of witches attacking and eating babies and cattle and so on in Europe and in Africa that sound very similar to cattle mutilation cases. So the word witch in some of the witch stories is used to describe things that are that kind of creepy extra-dimensional phenomena that suddenly falls into UFOs as well. So we're in the kind of it's Eurocentric to the point of racist to try and revitalize the word witch as only this kind of empowered feminist figure. It is that because we can phenomenologically assert that's true because it functions in a transformative way for people in the West, and I'm happy for them, but it's not the only thing. So these are some of the terms we need to get rid of: black, white magic, left-hand path, right-hand path, so that we can start to realize that magic can be both, and more than that, there are actual schools of it that do specialize in what we would consider black magic, but it's just a different, it's the cursing thing again. If you live in a culture or a country that doesn't have a functioning judicial system, what is your recourse if someone is harassing your family or has sexually assaulted your children or something? What is your recourse if there is no police force? Where do you go? And so is that black magic?
Yeah, that's one of those times where I think that I would definitely not call it black magic. And that was Gordon White. And we interviewed Gordon White in July of 2018. So I saved the best for last. Well, I wouldn't say the best for last. But, and if you guys want to hang out with us, we're over on Spreaker, Lighting the Void. That's where the chat room is. Everybody's chatting about all kinds of different things in here. Now, I saved this one because I think it was kind of the overall lesson that I learned, and I'll talk to you about it after this clip. But if you remember, way back in January 10th to be exact, of 2018, we talked to a well-known man in this genre named Whitley Strieber. And Whitley had gone through an experience of losing his wife and wrote a book about it. But there were also things that I learned about someone that I always looked at as just someone that had an encounter or an abduction experience. But I didn't know that he had several spiritual experiences before as well as after he lost his wife. So here's the thing. Well, I'll just tell you afterwards what I learned in 2018, the biggest thing I learned in 2018. So we're going to go back to January 10th of 2018 with Whitley Strieber.
Annie's lifetime. She was first, she was a really brilliant person. She was very smart. And that was important because she was also very open-minded. She had a master's in education from the Bank Street College of Education, which was one of the great education institutions in the United States. And she understood teaching. She was a teacher to her absolute core. I mean, she was in her essence, she was a teacher and still is, in fact. So when the communion experience happened to me, instead of saying, oh, my God, my husband's gone crazy, or, I got to keep him away from my child or something like that, her attitude was, how interesting, let's see what this all means and get it sorted out. And she was right at my elbow when I wrote communion. She read every word of it as I wrote it, and we worked it out together. And she kept saying, now here you're connecting the dots. We got to keep this in question because we don't actually know what's going on here. After the book was published, it was very successful, and we got letters. We got lots and lots of letters, hundreds of thousands of letters from all over the world, in fact. Anne took that whole project in hand. She read the letters, she hired a secretary to help her, and she cataloged them as well, the whole massive output, and they worked on it for years together. And in this process of doing this, Anne understood things about the close encounter experience that very few people have ever understood. But she was a woman, and MUFON in those days was an all-male operation, and they were stuck on the idea that these are flying saucers from another planet.
Right.
They had no interest whatsoever in listening to anything Ann said for all kinds of reasons. And still don't me. I mean, they still have nothing to do with me for the same reason. I'm an outsider. And but the problem is, I think in this case, the outsiders have a lot more insight into what's actually going on than the insiders do. So she came out of our office one day and she says to me, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. This is in the late 90s. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I look at this letter as an example. And it was a letter from somebody who had seen a dead relative with the visitors. And it occurred to me, I thought to myself, my word, that's happened at the cabin, and it's happened to me personally. On my first experience with the visitors, a dead friend was with them. And I didn't know he was dead at the time. And I thought initially that it was some kind of criminal shenanigans going on because I knew that he had joined the CIA after college. I hadn't really kept up with him very much. But I thought to myself, I had published a very controversial book about a year before, or 2 years before, called War Day. And I had been told by one of Ted Kennedy's staffers that this book would cause the administration, I think it was the Reagan administration at the time, to get angry, and I could expect retaliation, which I thought meant one of those political tax audits that they never do. They claim they never do them, but they do them all the time. They all do them.
Sure.
But then I thought to myself, my goodness, the next morning I've been beat up. I remember seeing these gigantic, strange, big figures that looked like bugs. What in the world could it be? And then I remembered that friend who was there and telling me all kinds of secrets about the stealth fighter and bomber program at the time, which was a deep, dark secret.
Yeah, nobody knew about it back then.
Nobody. I mean, the secrecy was extremely serious on that. And I suddenly knew all kinds of things about the technology of it and so forth. And I thought, well, maybe they drugged me. Maybe they put something in my food or my drink or something, and it was a criminal act, because if someone from the government had done that to you, it would be a crime, a major crime.
Absolutely.
So I set out to come into contact with this man. And the first sign, and I didn't really pick up on it at the time, that this had something to do with death came then, because it turned out he'd been dead, and this was now early January. He'd been dead since the previous March, and nearly a year. And I've confirmed that carefully. I've seen his death certificate. He definitely was dead. Oh. I talked to his brother about it. In fact, that's how I found out. And but I just didn't know what to make of that. To me, at the time, they looked like aliens, and that's what Bud Hopkins was telling me they were, and so on and so forth. So I sort of pushed the idea of his showing up there under the rug. But then Annie comes along after reading I guess it was still late 80s, 88, 89, and she says that. And also we had noticed that when people came to our cabin and encountered the visitors, and, I'm called a fraud and all kinds of things by these asses, but in fact, many people encountered the visitors at my cabin, and a lot of them are on the record. And, yet, they keep on going, oh, he's a fraud. And I say to myself, what about Raven Dana? What about Laurie Barnes? Are they frauds too? They saw the visitors at the cabin, and they've gone public with it. Others have as well. I've got an implant in my ear, and the attempt to remove it was videotaped. And the doctor has testified about exactly what he found. So, there's no fraud involved here at all. But there are an awful lot of people who wish it was not true, and they can't because they can't stand it. And we'll get into later why they can't. Anyway, we realized the first time anyone at the cabin saw a dead relative along with the visitors was Lori Barnes, our secretary. And Anne, by the way, she had these piles of letters she was going through, and I was way behind. She could open a letter and read it in the time it took me to fumble it open. I mean, she was amazing. She was really fast at everything, and not just at this. And so she said one day, I need a secretary, and I'm going to find a secretary in these letters. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem practical. I said something like, why don't you call Manpower or something? And a few minutes later, she says, here's the secretary. And she hands me this letter, and it's from a lady who says she's a singer and an actress, and she tells quite a remarkable story. And I said, but she's not a secretary. I said, look, she says, look at the handwriting. Have you ever heard of her? I said, no, I haven't heard of her. I said, okay, look at the combination of the handwriting and the fact that you've never heard of her. I'm going to call her up, and it's going to turn out she has secretarial skills. And she calls her up, and she says, this is Ann Strieber, and they talk for a couple seconds, and she says, so are you a secretary? And she says, oh, good. Well, listen, why don't you come over now, and because I'd like to see if you can get started in helping me, because I need a secretary. She hangs up. I said, well, where does she live? And she says, across the street.
Oh, my God.
That was the way Annie was. I mean, she just, anything like that, it happened like magic. She was a very magical human being. And so Lori Barnes comes over, and she becomes our secretary, her Anne's secretary. And then she comes up to the cabin. And lo and behold, she comes in one afternoon at the cabin after taking a walk on the road in front of the cabin and says, I just met my brother on the road. And she's flabbergasted. And we're sort of amazed. And I said, did you tell him you were coming up here? She says, no, you don't understand. My brother disappeared 20 years ago. He's been declared dead. And I thought, is he on the road now? And she said, he was standing there in a brown monk's outfit. And I asked him if he wanted to come in to the house. And he said, no, I just wanted to tell you I'm fine. This is not the exact story, but, sure. It's close, close enough. I want to tell you I'm fine. And he smiled, and he sort of drifted back into the woods and disappeared. Now, and then later that night, Raven Dana, who I mentioned earlier, and Lori Barnes both had direct encounters in the cabin with this small creature that came in. And it came in through a window, the screen of which had been screwed closed. She first entered Raven's bedroom, and she thought it was a raccoon at first. But then she thought, well, wait a minute, that screen can't be opened. And it put out its hand, and they touched hands. And it said to her, what can I do to help you, or something like that. And she said, you could walk down that hall where there was a low-light camera. And so it left the room. The next person to wake up was Lori Barnes. It woke her up. And she was face-to-face with it for a couple of minutes. Then it disappeared. And so that was an example.
They swear to you by this, right? They never said, hey, I was half asleep, or I might have been out of consciousness. No. This was wide open, wide awake.
Wide awake. Yeah, absolutely not. No, this is, you understand, these are two people in two different bedrooms seeing the same thing in sequence. And it went on. I won't go into everything that happened the rest of the night, but a lot happened. Well, I can tell you how it ended.
I'd like to hear if you don't mind.
Okay, I'll tell you how it ended. A little while later, the filmmaker who had the low-light camera that was on in the hallway trying to catch image of something awoke in the convertible couch in the bedroom and looked up and saw this little man with a great big head standing there looking at him beside the bed. And of course, it scared the bejesus out of him.
Right, I bet.
Because this was a guy who did not expect to see anything like that anywhere, and did not expect anything to happen in this cabin, and assumed that it was all a big nonsense, and he was being paid to make the documentary, so he didn't really care. So he's face to face with this. Whereupon, as soon as he feels fear, it does something that I had seen them do before, which is it becomes very menacing looking, and the head becomes like the head of a hawk, which scared him even further, and then it disappeared. So he's there, and he's waked his wife up, who's sleeping beside him, and they're talking about what he saw, and they don't see it anymore. Of course, if I'd been in the room, I would have told him it's still right beside the bed, because I knew it. I had learned by then how to sense these things when they were invisible, but these people knew nothing about that. So along about dawn, my son and I, because the cabin was so crowded, we were sleeping down in the woods in a little camping in a tent, and we go up back up to the house, and as we walk over a little hill and we can see the cabin below us, a figure comes out of the front door through the closed door, right through the door, and it's about 3 feet tall, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, and it's hooded, and it's sort of translucent. It comes down the front porch, then down the deck beside the house, across the yard and back, and goes darting off through the trees, racing past the trees and around the trees at breakneck speed, and is gone. We get to the house, and the filmmaker and his wife are on their feet. They have experienced a tremendous burst of heat so intense that they thought that the bed was on fire. And I understood a lot of this. I'd already talked to a physicist about this phenomenon of leaving heat behind. And he said, if you wanted to be invisible and you were capable of bending light, you would do that with gravity, and you would be in control of gravity. But the one thing that you couldn't do would be to get rid of the heat that was involved. The heat would stay with you until you released this, whatever it was. And when this being had to leave, because we were coming up, it released this, and therefore it was slightly visible, and it left behind all of the heat that had been in the heat sink that it was using to keep itself, is part of the process of keeping itself invisible. And this had happened before, and or things similar to it when we were at the cabin alone. But I don't talk about anything except things that were corroborated by other witnesses. So
does this stuff only happen at the cabin, Whitley?
A lot happened at the cabin, and for many years after we lost the cabin, not much happened.
Okay.
Then it's picked up dramatically now. More happens now than ever happened at the cabin in my life. But as I say, I have a rule of not discussing things that aren't corroborated by witnesses, and I can just give you the vague outlines of what happens now, and we can do that later. But I'm not going to go into great detail for that reason.
Sure, I understand. I get that.
In any case, those were two instances. Then there were these letters saying that the dead were involved. People were seeing their dead friends and relatives with the aliens, so-called aliens. And then we had a situation where a man was frantically trying to get a hold of me, and he said he got a hold of my agent, my literary agent in New York, which took some doing back before the internet. And I got in touch with him, called him, and he said, "I want to ask you a question." He was in the FAA, as I recall. "I I want to ask you a question that's very important to me, and I want to tell you a story. And so I listened to him, and what he told me was that he and his wife had been sleeping. They'd been in the living room. Their little 7-year-old was asleep upstairs, and their dog was asleep on the hearth in front of, and already been out and was ready to sleep for the night, an old dog. And all of a sudden, the dog became very agitated and got up and had to go back outside again, very unusual for this dog. As the wife was taking the dog out, she saw like a comet go past. They were living in Georgia, and there were a lot of pine trees, and disappear below the horizon of pines. And she called back to her husband, "You're going to get a call in a few minutes. I just saw a plane going in on fire." The next moment, their son came running downstairs saying, "Mommy, Daddy, Mommy, Daddy." George, call him, his older brother, came into my bedroom with a bunch of little blue men, and he wanted me to tell you that he's all right. And the parents were possessed to know whether or not this had ever happened to anybody else, because this older boy had died in an auto accident shortly before.
Oh, my.
And I was able to tell him, yes, it does happen. It's not uncommon. And this was a big moment in my life, because I felt like I had relieved them of a great deal of suffering. And it went on like that for years. Then 2004 rolls around, and suddenly in October, Annie has a stroke. She has a hemorrhagic stroke, a really bad hemorrhagic stroke. Collapses in the bathroom. By a damn miracle, I get her to the hospital in time, where she is over, and this is in the book, in the Afterlife Revolution. You read all about how what happened. She miraculously recovers from this after a tremendous ordeal, because she was not expected to live. It was a bad stroke. And when she comes out of it, she says that she's had a near-death experience. It changed her life completely. And in the Afterlife Revolution, there's an appendix at the end, which is one of the things. It's just a short diary entry from Anne about her near-death experience. And it's one of the most compact explanations of this and why it matters, and what is involved in moving on past this life that's ever been written. It's 2 pages long, but it's tremendously useful and valuable. It's a story that she would tell every chance she got for the years left in her life, which were 16 more years. And what it is this. She found herself in something like a railroad station or a big bus station or something. And there were all kinds of people sitting around there holding big burdens, big suitcases and bags and stuff. And she realized that unless they put those burdens down, that is to say, that the angers, the hatreds, the lusts, and the desires, and all of the things in life, the things they thought they had missed out on, all of those things, and gave them up, they couldn't move on. They would just stay there. And she used to say and conclude this by saying what I'm going to say now: you have to put those burdens down. And she knew. Now you understand, this is a woman who has read thousands of letters about interactions with the dead. She has studied this. Now she's had a near-death experience. She begins to read about and study near-death experiences in the afterlife. She is a woman who becomes a real expert, because Anne is a person who forgets nothing. She forgets nothing. If she reads it, it's there. And she becomes an extraordinary expert in this whole business because she's probably at that point the only person in the world who even related the close encounter experience to the afterlife. And so she's got a level of insight that nobody else on earth, I don't think, has ever had before. Then, probably as a result of having had too many brain scans, X-rays when she was being treated for the aneurysm, for the hemorrhagic stroke, in 2013, she's diagnosed with brain cancer. We get the cancer partially removed, but it's not all gone, and she goes on a long period of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, cannabis therapy, everything we can do to help her.
Sure, yeah.
We get the tumor stopped against all odds. They thought she had 6 months to live, and 2 years later she was still very much alive. But then the weight of the tumor, there's 15% of it couldn't be removed, begins to cause her brain to fail. In other words, the capillaries and stuff in it that this tumor is clinging to begin to break, and she starts to have strokes. She says to me, Whitley, I'm going to end up completely locked in and helpless if I let this continue. I'm finished. I'm leaving.
She said she was leaving?
She said she was leaving. No, she did not just die. Anne made a decision. She made a decision to go.
Oh, man.
And that was the hardest experience I have ever had. Every moment of it is still happening in me, and it always will until I am finally released from this life myself. But she did it, and she was not afraid. She did it brilliantly and skillfully. And she
went out on her terms, not somebody else's.
She went out on her terms, very definitely. She did everything on her terms, and she was usually right about everything she did, and this she was certainly right about, because there was no question that the strokes would incapacitate her soon, and when they did, she could no longer make the choice. And if you look at the law, you'll find you can't make the choice for somebody. Once they're helpless, then it's up to nature. And she did not wish to do that. So what she did was she stopped eating and drinking. And hospice all over the country help people who decide to do this. It's nothing unusual.
Right.
It's been affirmed by the Supreme Court that it's perfectly legal to do. And when they say help, but all they do is they make them comfortable. They don't assist them in any way. You can't. And so I spent the time that it took making sure that as long as she was conscious, the option of quitting and deciding to eat and drink again was always immediately there. And she would not do that. She went into a coma. And the first thing that happened that was unusual is one of the caregivers suddenly said, she just asked me to get red pajamas. She wants to die, to die wearing red pajamas. And I thought, how strange. But this woman leaped up and ran out and went to a department store immediately to get Anne red pajamas. I mean, she heard that. She didn't just dream it up. She was absolutely possessed. So we got Annie into the red pajamas, and she died in them. And I think Anne was testing her ability to communicate because she was already sort of half in and out of her body. A few hours later, I was having dinner in the dinette with my kids. We have a little apartment. We're not rich. And people always say very critical things about, Whitley Strieber, he's just in it for the money. But, I made a lot of money on communion, but it's been a long time. that I've made much of any money at all on anything. So that wasn't a factor. So anyway, we're sitting there eating, and I suddenly hear Annie say, "Whitley, I'm dying right now." I heard it in my head. I ran into the room, and she was lying there. I lay beside her. I put my hand on her heart, and I started saying, "Goodbye, goodbye." And I felt her release herself from her body and literally rise out right through my hand. And her heart stopped. And she had died. But the thing that was so a lot of odd things happened. Anne was no ordinary. She didn't die in an ordinary way at all. The closest thing I found to the manifestations that occurred is in the Tibetan tradition, where they talk about a person who has reached a certain level of evolution spiritually comes into a state called the rainbow body. But what happened was, it was as if her whole appearance was kind of made of light, because the moment that she died, I've seen people pass on before, and they don't look like. Anne was enormously diminished. As soon as she died, she looked like she was half the size she had been before, and her face was hardly recognizable in that from one instant to the next.
Wow.
And
so she packed a lot of energy. That's what it sounds like
she
to
was
me.
a lot of Anne was energy. And then when they were taking her away in the hearse, this mist came everywhere and sort of hung over the area, which is also another sign of the rainbow body. First, that diminishment, and then this mist. So I took a picture of it as it drove off with this mist all around it. It's very hard to talk about this.
I understand.
It's very hard for me. Because for me, the way I am, the type of consciousness I have, all of these moments are right now. I don't have a past or a future. I'm right now. And so what I'm telling you feels to me like it's happening right now.
Yeah, it's not a story to you. You're feeling it as you're saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. So then when I was going to her wake, rainbow after rainbow appeared in the sky. And we took pictures of those rainbows. And that's when I realized that Anne had died in a very high state of consciousness. And, Annie was she was an extraordinary person, an incredibly lucky man for me to have met her. And not even 2 hours, about an hour and a half after she passed, a friend telephoned and said, "Whitney, I just had the strangest thing happen. I heard Anne tell me to call you." And I was sitting there in the living room in a state of just complete meltdown, saying to myself, "Honey, do you still exist? Do you still hear in any way?" And that's when the call came in. And so I said to her, "Belle, Anne just died. She died an hour and a half ago." And the woman had no way of knowing she had just died. And it went on like that. A couple of days later, I was out in the mountains above, out above the desert, above Palm Springs, with my kids, just trying to get away from the house and, to experience, to try to still live, because I really wanted to follow her very badly. They were watching me carefully because I'm telling you, the temptation was tremendous. So,
can't imagine, man.
Well, really it still is, frankly. I mean, I'm here doing this, but I know there's another life and a better life, and the only thing that keeps me from leaving is the feeling that I'll get in trouble for having left early. So,
well, I want you to understand something too, Whitley. Of all the people that have been skeptical of you, you've done everything this planet has asked you to do to tell your story, and you've got lots of people that follow you and love your story and love you. So I know you know.
Well, it's nice to hear that because I often feel very alone. And it's very nice to hear that, and it's reassuring. And I hope the story is getting through to people that we are in a little corner of a great big conscious universe that wants us to find ourselves and become more than we are now.
And I think that is the moral of what I was trying to get to this evening: the human potential, what's really been hidden from you, and to not be afraid of it, because fear is really the only thing that keeps us back. And that life, I believe still, I'm kind of coming to this theory, is one of the greatest things in the universe. And we need to learn how to tap into our potential a little bit more to live it. And I want to, we possibly might do this again tomorrow night, like the best of 2018. I'm not sure. Depends on the feedback from tonight. But I do got to say, this show was produced by the Fringe FM and cannot be rebroadcasted or syndicated without written permission. And music was by Chronox. Actually, right now, just Chronox tonight. And if you're listening live, stay tuned for the Secret Teachings with Ryan Gable. We'll see you on the other side of 2018. It's been an awesome year. Good night.
On this program do not necessarily reflect those of the Fringe FM, KTLK Digital Broadcasting, its sponsors, affiliates, or staff. Listener discretion is advised. We told you weeknights on the Fringe FM are now even better, and we mean it.
Do it live!
Where else can you hear the best shows and the best talent? Kick off your evening with our newest host, Alex Exum, live at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 Eastern. Hang out with me, Joe Roop, on Lighting the Void at 9 Pacific, midnight Eastern. Ryan Gable expands your mind on the Secret Teachings at midnight Pacific, 3 a.m. Eastern. We're bringing the heat every single night. Fire it up, the Fringe FM.
Yahoy there. This is Gigi from Shift Happens. And holy shit, you're listening to KTLK, the Fringe FM. Hey, don't you dare turn that stinking music.